Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I'm calling it Black Vein Blues. It makes sense if you think about it. About a month ago, it started, slow and quiet. I had just come home from school to find my father prodding at the corpse of a gator that washed up on the bank a couple of paces from our home. At that time, I'd been furious, thinking his redneck ass had killed it even in spite of the numerous charges he'd get slapped with for killing a protected species. It was only when I approached it did I realize just how bad it was. The thing was bloated and pale, with ink-black webbing sprouting just under the skin. My father had been prodding it with the tail end of a fire poker, so the belly of it had opened and spilled onto the ground. Its guts, a grease-black spill on the deadened grass. I remember retching at the sight and smell, turning away and cursing out loud for my father to get the fuck away from it. He hadn't been too happy to hear his own spawn yelling at him like he was a simple fool. So I ended up being charged with cleaning the thing off our property, but only after he skinned it to sell the leather once he finished up. He never got to sell it. He didn't last that long. Later that evening, after a long shower, I'd gone up to the store to buy some things for dinner. Nothing big or costly, so it only took me a half hour to get the shit and hike back. I remember the store had been eerily silent. All of the other customers lost in some sort of daze. Some didn't even notice when I knocked directly into them, their glassy eyes flying to me and then back to whatever they were focused on. I wrote it up for being a sign of the times, what with the pre-existing illness racking the land long before this one ever touched our lands. The cashier had just been about the only person with half of their wits, but only enough to warn me to look out for sick people on my way back to the house. Little did I know I would find out just what she meant the moment I entered my driveway. There my father was, stood in the center of the road completely nude and coated in inky black blood. It was like something out of a horror movie. His eyes had reflected in the shine of the headlights, already dead focused. "Dad, what the fuck is wrong with you?" I had asked. Throwing open the car door and stepping, something stopped me then. Self-preservation, probably. An instinct buried within my mind that warned me not to go near the man drooling ropes of blood and mucus. It was a good thing, too, because when he let out that animal shriek and lunged for me, I had enough time to get right back into the car and slam the door behind me before he hit the metal behind me. He was so maddened that he slammed his face over and over into the window, not 5 inches from my face, blurring the glass with the blackened blood. I was so petrified. I didn't even think for a minute, just staring at that thing that had once been my father as it gored itself against the windows of our old truck. My call to the cops had been frantic, and I almost thought they might not believe me until the operator let me know someone would be coming up to check the property in the next couple of minutes. I wanted to scream at them to hurry, but I simply shut my eyes and I prayed the windows held up. Then, as if it knew what I had done, it just stopped. I could see its white milky eyes through the haze on my windows, watching me intently. It was the closest I'd ever been able to observe one of them. I saw what the disease did to their body, bleeding through their skin and veins, until it looked like they were coated with blackened cobwebs. They no longer had pupils or eye color, really, replaced by bluish milk-white circles that shot from side to side as their blind gazes sought out who knows what in the dark. He was so still and calm that for a second I had thought he might have come to, but then its broken jaw opened wide enough to hit its chest, and it let out a shriek that pierced the night and shook the entire car before it turned and sped into the wild. I hadn't seen him since. Not in the trees, not in the town. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. The cops had arrived an hour later, but he was already gone. And so they left with a shake of their head, muttering about crazed teenagers. I wonder if they knew what they were going to be walking right back into when they got home later that night. My father hadn't been the only one affected, leading me to believe that it wasn't the gator that turned him mad. In 24 hours, the town had gone from normal to complete chaos. The disease had taken over, turning a good portion of our population into drooling monsters. It attacks your mind first, is what I think happens. Your brain overheats, scrambling like eggs in a hot skillet and leaving behind something mindless and violent. Not quite like turning into a zombie, but close enough to where some of the townsfolk went by those old rules. Any bites, and you get a bullet to the head. I witnessed that myself on day 3. Just when I had been brave enough to venture out into the silence. Needless to say, I stopped traveling out in the open after that. From what little I could gather, the town went completely nuts. The sane people turned right into something out of an atypical apocalypse movie, where the people went right into savage mode in order to keep order. Law enforcement had been quick to interfere, but only enough to establish themselves as kings of the castle and wall off any resources the rest of the townsfolk may need. From what I had heard from the one actually sane person I'd met, that they had put away some of the people affected with black vein in the jail cells to experiment with. I shuddered at the thought of what that might mean. Still, that wasn't the worst of it. You know that phrase, the one popularized by modern movies and media? What if humans were the real bad guy? God, they were so wrong. Nothing could compare to what those things were doing. You see, the difference between them and zombies is that they still are entirely human, or at least think like them. Even as they turn into slobbering, rage-infested creatures, they still have the presence of mind to hunt. I'm lucky enough to have witnessed it before I got caught into one of their traps. In the middle of the night, one day I had decided to use the darkness in order to head into town, to grab whatever supplies I could loot from unguarded businesses. Just as I had reached town, I saw them gathered in the middle of the road, looking up at something strung to a streetlight. There were people caught in one of those hunter nets meant to trap large game. Their wails of terror had filled the night as the 3 of them had been slowly lowered to the ground and promptly ripped to shreds at the hands of those monsters. They had taken their time, seeming to bask in the horror and degradation as they killed them one by one. I couldn't look away. Something within me refused to believe it was even real. I had seen terrible shit on TV before. But watching your neighbors laugh and shout in delight as they remove the organs of people you once shopped side by side with was a whole new ballgame. It didn't stop there. The evidence of their rampages was more and more apparent as you snuck down the streets. There were stores that had been burnt to the ground, others splattered with blood and gore. There were clear stains on the street where you could see victims had tried to flee before being drugged into whatever hell was awaiting them. I didn't even make it to the store before I turned and ran all the way back to my house. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that day. Nothing could erase the memory of those horrific things I'd witnessed or the shit I would continue to see every time. I gathered the courage to leave my home. I'm stuck. Utterly stuck in my decaying cabin. I can't trust the water anymore because I'm almost 100% sure where it came from. It would be the only explanation for the gator washing up with the disease a day before it affected our first townfolk. I have enough food to last for a while, but it's not food I'm worried about. It's the water. Even with my stockpile, I'll only last the next month or so. I know what some of you are going to say. Get the fuck out of there. Take your truck and speed right out of town limits before you're claimed too. It's too late for that. I saw the trucks arrive not hours ago. The barriers set up in record time. Anyone brave enough to go near them gets snatched up by the men in yellow, or shot right between the eyes. I know well enough about our government to know those who got taken won't end up well and safe on the other side. I beg of you, if you have any information I could use to help myself out in this situation, please tell me. I'm running out of options here, and I don't know how far this has gone. I suppose some of you are going to be disappointed with me. After all, there's no good end to this story. I wish I could tell you everything turned out fine in the end and I used all those survival tips to flee into the woods, but I hardly had enough time to read them before the end had already begun. Things had gone south since I last posted, and I, like the disease, it happened fast. It was like something sparked in the air, catching all at once and starting the blaze that would end it all. It was rain. A storm so thick you'd end up soaked just by looking at it. I knew it was the end, even before it wet the very earth on which I stood. There is something I should admit. I'm not entirely immune, as some of you might have thought. I just haven't been claimed by the rage the others seem to have fallen victim to. My veins went black, but my head remained the same, a cool 98 degrees on the thermometer. I thought for a moment, even with the sickness taking root in every corner of my body, that I might somehow be fine, that I was just not affected like the others. But then there was the pull. It had seated itself right on the back of my brain, whispering to my consciousness with every hour that went past. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the impact they had on my mind as each time I felt the caress of its shadowed touch. I'd find myself leaving my own mind for a split second. Sometimes it was so strong, I'd find myself opening my eyes what seemed like a split second after last closing them, standing in the water right outside my house, staring empty down into its inky depths. It was part of the reason why I hadn't joined up with any of the other survivors. Well, that, and there was no way I was going to trust them when half of them were willing to put a bullet in an innocent, if there was even the slight amount of question about their behavior. I didn't even want to think about what might happen. If I had the guts to approach one of those men in yellow, stealing people right off the streets. They never took the survivors. They weren't here to rescue us or to try and help us survive. Within our town's quarantine, they stole the infected, and they shot anyone who thought might interfere. Perhaps it was luck, or just some sort of twisted fate. But I had seen them in action, speeding into town in their armored little vans, and grabbing the infected one by one. One of the ones they had taken had been the cashier from day one. I almost wanted to laugh. "Look out for the sick," she had said. Famous last words. As much as I wanted to, I knew the best option for me was to remain hidden until something drastically changed and I was forced to relocate. Unfortunately for us all, that something was the rain. Something drew me out of the house that day. That voice in my mind calling me to come into the open and see what it had in store for me. I didn't think of my safety, nor much of anything else. It was a mindless gut feeling that had me putting one foot in front of the other, until I was standing right in front of the section of town that had housed the rest of the survivors. Most of them had made their homes in the town hall, the only stone and brick building in the next 10 miles that could potentially protect them from a threat like this. It had been a smart idea. Being as it's not easy to burn down a brick building, made it even smarter with the obvious defenses they had set up. Though it hadn't been enough if my being brought there meant anything. The doors were wide open. Tables and barriers spilled out its large entryway. Blood oozed out of the building, its impossibly bright red color making still fresh stains on the pristine white steps. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see, but whatever burned in my skull didn't care about my wants. It dragged me step by step into the building until I stood right in the center of the storm, right in the center of the screams. They were everywhere. On the walls, in the rafters. Hundreds of infected sat laughing around the ring in the center of the room, where the blood ran thickest. It was a bone-chilling laughter, one of pure madness and glee. There was only one survivor left. A man, unfamiliar to me, lay on the center of the floor. I won't describe what they had done to him, for I would rather not inflict that terrible knowledge on anyone else. I will say, though, that there was no way the man should have been alive. Not with as little of him as there was left. Still he was, eyes wide and mouth open in an endless silent scream. The blood in his mouth muted anything he might have been trying to say, but I doubted he could have done anything other than to beg for mercy at that moment. I was almost sick. Almost. If what I saw hadn't numbed me, I might have fallen to my knees and retched my guts out. But I was already long past that. I only watched, feeling nothing but numbness and pity as my ears began to burn. For some reason, they did not attack me. Maybe because they sensed the illness that had already consumed my body. Maybe they were so distracted with the show, they didn't care. Either way, it wasn't a blessing. I would have preferred death over watching them make playthings of the bodies of the last strugglers left of the town's survivors. I don't know how long I kept going through the downpour, until I found myself staring down one of the couple exit roads our town has. It was one of the places where the barricades had been set up. This one larger and made mostly for the purpose of keeping the diseased in and those fortunate enough not to be caught in the massacre out. Only when I got there, it was completely void of any meaningful life. No men in yellow. No military guards. Not a single sign of life. That is, apart from the black veins. I can see them standing there, completely still, as if they all were listening for any movement. Only one acknowledged my arrival, its blind white eyes snapping up to me. It remained like that, completely still as it monitored my movements. All of the black veins I've seen as of late had been doing exactly that. Standing still, listening, hunting. How many poor uninfected souls had fallen victim to them, I wondered. How was it I hadn't? I had a million questions, all burning like a hot iron through my quickly overheating mind. As much as I wondered, I knew the answer. I felt the answer burning bright right behind my eyes. I don't know if this has spread, or how I made it this long, but it hardly matters. It's over now. Time is ticking for me. This I know. I already see my veins in my arms darkening even further with the illness. I feel my very humanity peeling away like layers from an onion. Soon, there will be little left of me, but the vessel that is my body. I couldn't take the injustice of it all. I didn't do anything to deserve this. I stayed in the shadows. I didn't talk to anyone. I followed the rules and did as my father asked, and I never got into trouble. I was a good kid. So why is my mind filling with those sickening thoughts? I see him now as I sit at my computer chronicling what I know is the final moments of my sanity. He's standing out in the woods, completely still as he looks directly through my window, right to where I sit. It's as if he knows what's come over me. Maybe he knew from the start, and he's just been waiting this whole time for me to realize it too. One thing I did think was weird that I thought you should know before I log off for good was that he wasn't alone. None of them were. They had never been. Look out for the shadows. That's where they go to hide.
The lantern on my desk flickered and then went out, drenching the cabin in a tar-like darkness. I cursed quietly to myself. It seemed only the day before that I had filled the lamp, and I had been ashore since. Carefully, I placed my quill into the rest affixed to my desk, and then fastened the lid of my ink. I had cleaned up spills too many times to make that mistake again. The light coming in through the porthole was just enough that I could make out the furnishing of my cabin. I turned and stood to find the flask with my lamp oil. And that's when I first saw him. He was standing in the far corner of the small space, not 5 feet from me, an unsettling smile on his face. He had a mouth packed with needles that reflected the light of the moon, and I couldn't make out his eyes. They must have been sunken into his face so far that they were invisible in the dark of the room. I startled, stepping back and tripping over the chair I had just departed. I almost fell over, but caught myself by grabbing onto the corner of the desk. My attention was only pulled away for a second, a fraction of a second, but when I looked back up, the man in the corner was gone. He had not moved or attempted to hide elsewhere. He was simply no longer there. Years at sea had given me plenty of opportunity to see all manner of strange phenomenon, and never had I doubted what my eyes told me. Not until that moment. No matter how certain I felt that what I had witnessed was real, it was impossible to see the now empty cabin and not believe that I must have been mistaken. I'd have sworn I had seen a ghost, but there were no men dead or otherwise that looked like the one I had just seen. Perhaps it had been a demon. That was a thought I didn't wish to dwell on. The voyage, I knew, was ill-fated. I had felt it even before boarding the ship, and now that we had been underway for nearly an hour, I was more certain than ever that we had made a grave mistake in taking on this commission. The pay had been high, 2 months of shipping between the Isle and the mainland to be made up in a few hours, but there was a reason the price was high. There was also a reason that we had been asked and that there had been little competition for the job. When the light in the sky had burned the night so brightly that it was as a second sun falling into the ocean, everyone awake had seen the spectacle. As the light faded over the horizon, a thunderous roar had shaken the earth and shattered glass in the windows of houses. It had been like a physical strike, so deep and powerful that it rumbled your bones and turned your stomach. The waves had come next, great white-crested walls of water smashing into the port and destroying ships and buildings alike. A few dozen vessels remained undamaged, with hundreds more broken and in need of major repairs. The Water Queen, my hard-earned brigantine, had been lucky, at least in the sense that she took almost no damage. I retrieved my oil flask and went to fill the lamp, but soon discovered the lamp wasn't empty. The wick had gone out on its own. The glass was down. There was no possibility that it had blown out. Oil lamps didn't blow out easily when they weren't covered, and my storm lantern certainly hadn't just flickered out in the stillness of my cabin. This was another dark portent. Superstition went hand and foot with sailors, and though I tried to keep myself above such things, I could feel the churn of evil in the air. A knock on my door grabbed my attention just as I lit my lamp again. I turned about with a sense of trepidation. "Yes?" I called, suddenly convinced that the man I'd seen in the shadows was standing on the other side of the door, his needle-filled mouth gaping wide, just waiting for me to pull it open so that he could step inside and rend my flesh to strips like a tattered sail. "Captain, the lookout has spotted something in the waters ahead." I recognized the voice of my first mate, and the tension building in me flickered out like my candle had, not long before. I came to the door and opened it. "Mr. Travis, what was there to see?" I asked, sliding out of my room with a feeling of relief. A feeling that fled as I turned to draw the door closed and saw that the lantern was out again. Ice ran down my spine, and I had to disguise my hesitation with a small cough before pulling my cabin closed fully. "We had a couple different men check the glass, but we're not sure what it is. It looks as though the water is aglow, lights rising up from the brine like ghost lanterns. Something seems to be submerged, but the lookouts say it doesn't look like a ship, and it's not a natural island of any kind. At this juncture, your guess is probably better than ours," he explained as we walked up the stairs onto the deck. The men were quiet now, all looking off the side of the ship facing the lights ahead of us in the ocean. It was an uncanny kind of glow, pale and strong. It didn't flicker like fire, but neither was it the shade of sunlight. It was unlike any light I had seen before. We were cutting our way through the water in the direction of the glow, and it was coming closer quickly. The deck was strangely quiet as everyone watched the unknown draw closer. "Come alongside the lights," I called out loudly, getting the crew moving again. I watched as the men, remembering themselves, went back to work, but not without some clear signs of anxiety. I could see the look of fearful superstition in their eyes. Sailors didn't care for the unknown, and I could understand their sentiment. At that moment, I would have preferred to do anything else other than steer my ship towards those damnable lights. "Something about this doesn't sit right with me, Captain," Mr. Travis said quietly, his deep voice pitched just for my hearing. "This whole voyage has been strange. Crew have been reporting all kinds of weird happenings since we left dock, and I myself thought I heard voices rising up out of the water, like men screaming for help out amongst the waves. I've been sailing many years, and nothing like this has ever happened to me before. I'm not the kind to fall for tales of sea beasties waiting to swallow us up, but this whole voyage has a foul reek about it." I nodded once. "I am agreed, Mr. Travis, but we are beholden by contract to make the investigation our governor requires. He would not be pleased if we came back and told him we were frightened off by some lights we knew we would find when we left shore. We must at least have a look." The first mate nodded his head as though this was the answer he had expected. "When I first saw the star fall across the sky, I felt sick down to the marrow of my bones." He looked over at me, and his eyes held a specter of terror I had never seen there. I thought to myself, "Mr. Travis, this is the end of you." The falling star had terrified everyone who had seen it. We had all seen the occasional star streaking across the night sky, but this one had scorched the night, as bright as the noon sun, but boiling with fire. It blotted out all the rest of the stars, even the moon, and then it crashed into the ocean. The glow lit the horizon for hours. The waves had come crashing into the shore, even through the natural breakers made by the volcanic mountains that ringed the island. Ships were crushed, and the people unfortunate enough to be in the streets near the docks were washed away, dragged out to sea, and shredded on the volcanic rock, only to be returned with the tide in the form of tattered chum. "We've come back from fiercer seas than these, Mr. Travis. We'll come back this time too, and with enough coin to drink ourselves well into the next shipping season. It wasn't easy to muster good cheer, but I did my best to make a show of it. The ship was carrying 65 souls, and I didn't intend to lose a single one of them. As is so often the case, fate cared little for the intentions of men. The lookout was the first to die. I was standing near the ship's wheel, watching as the glow from the sea began to brighten the night, turning it into some kind of haunted semblance of what dawn should have been. The light that came from the sea had an unnatural hue to it, a white starkness that was almost cold, and I kept thinking that no light should be cold. Since man had first mastered fire, heat had become the comforting, calming touch associated with light. Not only was the dark chased away, but so was the ice and snow. Why then did this eye-scouring brightness make me shiver in my coat? My first mate had called the light source ghost lanterns, and I thought the name was apt. And then the glow was gone, out like someone had thrown a black curtain over the whole thing. A terrible dull thump that was somehow both weighty and wet at the same time was accompanied by the horrified voices of my men. Screams and gasps were not the kind of sounds you like to hear aboard ship, and they got me moving immediately. Without the light of the sea, the ship felt darker than it should. The lantern light seemed to barely cast more than a few feet. "Karn has fallen from the lookout," someone cried out. "Where is Cordry?" someone else shouted. "Someone get the doctor." "It's too late for that," someone else said, their voice quieter as I cut my way through my men to the side of their fallen comrade. I needed look only for a second to realize that they were correct. No one could help Karn now. He had landed on his head, and the force of the blow had liquefied his skull before shoving the shrapnel back up into his neck, even as his organs had attempted to compress out through the newly torn opening. Someone gagged and threw up, and I turned my head away. "Someone bring a tarp and cover the poor boy up," I growled, keeping my voice steady with the force of my will alone. I had seen someone fall from the crow's nest before, but they hadn't landed head first like this. Doing so by accident would be the absolute worst of luck. There were lines and beams along the mast on the way down, and the people I had known that had fallen had at least attempted to slow themselves down, and none had landed head first. Had I not known better, I would have assumed he had dived from the nest intentionally. It was in this moment that the ship struck something. I had never been aboard a ship that had run aground at full speed, and even had I done so, nothing could have prepared me for the force of the impact. Men were thrown to their knees, and Karn's body went sliding across the deck, leaving a trail of gore in his wake. I hit the deck hard enough that my knees were bruised and battered, and I managed to rip my coat. I was struggling back to my feet when my first stumbled towards me, offering me his hand, which I gladly took. I wasn't as young as I once had been, and the wood of the floor had been far less forgiving than I might have liked. "What did we hit?" I asked, trying to get my bearings in the chaos. "I don't know, sir. There are no reefs out here, and we are in open water as far as I can see." The first seemed as lost as I felt. I made my way carefully to the railing of the ship, which was the same action most of the men aboard were taking. Everyone was trying to figure out how we had run aground. The light that had been glowing from below the water was gone now, and that left everything eerily dark. Other than the whispered voices of the crew, there was only the sound of water lapping against the hull and the creak of distressed wood as the ship settled on whatever had caught it beneath the water's surface. "Jensen, get to below decks and figure out where we've hit. I need to know if there is damage to be worried about." I ordered a man standing nearby. He didn't look pleased to be taken from his place at the railing to go below decks, but I needed information, and I needed the crew back in operational shape. "Aye, sir," he called, and then he was off to do as ordered. With the light from the sea gone, things were dark out to sea. We couldn't make out anything down at the waterline beyond the fact that there was a waterline. I tried to figure out which way the lights had been from where we currently were. It didn't seem that we should have reached them yet. Someone on the other side of the ship screamed, and all attention turned in that direction. The scream grew louder, and then dwindled before a splash sounded in the ocean on that side. "Something dragged Enders over the side," someone shouted, and then the voices of the crew erupted into chaos. "Get the guns," someone shouted, and suddenly men were surging around me, running for the doors down towards the storerooms. "Stay yourselves, men," I called out, trying to regain order. "Marshall, Avery, you head down to the storeroom and bring up the weapon crates. The rest of you keep your stations. This is still a ship, and on board ship we keep order. You hear me?" As I was saying this, my eyes caught movement along the port side rail, just opposite from where I was. I saw what looked like the arm of a man reaching over the railing and grabbing hold of a sail line that was lashed down. The arm was too long, maybe 5 or 6 feet, and narrow. Someone else saw it and let out a scream of terror. "Demon!" a voice shouted, and now chaos really was upon us. The thing coming over the rail used its grip on the line to pull itself up and onto the deck. The impossibly long arm was followed by a second, and then a head that looked like it had torn its way free of a sailor's nightmare. It had the black eyes and mouth of a shark, but the head was long and mobile like an eel, flopping around as if no bones attached it to the rest of the thing. Those black eyes were on 3 different sides of its head, for a grand total of 6 of these terrible sensory mechanisms. As it drew itself over the railing and rolled haphazardly onto the deck, men ran over one another to get out of its range. It had a body that was somewhat like a man's, but it was too long, too narrow. It wore no clothing, and its greenish-hued flesh was taut over a ribcage that seemed to take up all of its torso before it shrank into hips that gave way to a set of 3 legs which were each of a different length. This should have made it difficult for the thing to move, but as soon as it was on the deck, it flopped onto these limbs, using its arms to counter the unbalance of the rest of it, and then it was perambulating with unnatural speed. It tore across the deck after the nearest man as screams lifted into the air. Someone grabbed a boathook and threw it as the creature streaked past them towards a man who had just turned his back and was attempting to run towards the nearest door down into the ship. The boathook struck the creature, but was quickly knocked away without breaking its monstrous pace. We all watched as the thing sprang from the deck and slammed into the running man with enough force to crush him against the deck of the ship. He let out a wail of horror, but a moment later, the mouth of the terrible thing was ripping into him, tearing strips of flesh from his back and choking them down before moving on to the next bite. "Hooks, knives, grab what you can and kill that thing!" I shouted, reaching for the saber I had forgotten down in my room. I cursed to myself and grabbed a boathook from a barrel near the railing. It would have to do. We advanced on it in a group, and it paid us no mind as it continued to eat the man it had slammed onto the deck. He was still screaming. It was the kind of sound that I knew would haunt my memories for as long as I lived. Not wanting my men to think I wasn't ready to put my life on the line, I charged the creature with my makeshift weapon out in front of me. I thought I'd be able to stab the beast before it knew I was coming. It seemed distracted, but I was still a good 4 feet away when its head sprung up, a massive chunk of human arm falling from its still chewing jaws. 2 of its eyes looked right at me, and I stopped in place, skidding closer against my desire to do so. One of those hind limbs, the leg things, struck out blindingly fast. It reminded me of the leg of a locust, but only in shape and function, not in physical characteristics. It looked more like a human leg than an insect's, other than the green color. Either way, it stretched far further than I thought possible, and small claws that I hadn't seen slashed at me, cutting my boathook neatly in half, and then slicing my left arm wide open as easily as a man might gut a fish. It was my turn to scream then. I fell back as the beast rounded, coming in for what I thought was going to be a kill, but it didn't attack me. Instead, it snagged another of the crew, using one of its massive arms to yank him out of place as he attempted to turn and flee. He dropped the knife he had as it dragged him back across the deck, grabbing him with its other arm as well. There was a terrible cracking, ripping sound, and the creature tore the man in half, splitting him like a dried wishbone. Entrails splattered across the deck. The first man attacked by this new monster was attempting to drag himself away with his one remaining arm. It wasn't going well. There was so much blood. I knew he was dead already. There was no way we had stopped the bleeding in time, even if the deck hadn't been in chaos. I struggled to stem my own bleeding as the monster tore into the man it had just spilled open, voraciously consuming his insides. I used my belt to apply pressure to my wound as one of my men came up and helped me to my feet. Everyone was running for the longboats now. Somehow the ship was on fire, the flames licking across the deck with a hunger matched only by that of the beast devouring my men. A sail took alight, the tarred stays spreading the fire as quick as could be. Fire, the kind of fire that was breaking out on the ship now. It was the death knell of any sea ship. "Abandoned ship!" I called out, though I hardly needed the words. People were scrambling to get away, but other things had gotten aboard. More creatures similar, and yet different from the first one, were dragging themselves across the wood planking. People were dying everywhere, gruesome slaughter filling the air with a cacophony of wailing agony. There was no sense to any of the creatures. No creator would make beasts of so little order, and nature had not the stomach for this kind of horror. They were an embodiment of chaos, of violent hatred. Had I reached into the heart of humanity and drawn out the black tar of every evil and vile thought we'd ever dreamed, I still would not have had the spark necessary to draw these horrors into being. "Captain, come on, we have to move." I looked up at the man speaking. I recognized him as one of our skilled craftsmen. He had an arm tucked under mine and a steadying hand on my shoulder. "There's nothing here for us to save," he said, drawing me after him. I knew his words were true, but I still couldn't fathom how this had all happened so quickly. How long had it been since I was writing in my journal in my room? 5 minutes? 10? Somewhere between the two, I thought. And yet in those fleeting minutes, everything had changed. "Abandoned ship!" I called again, one last time, and then I let myself be drawn to an escape craft. The boat hit the water hard, and then the men were at oars, trying to get us clear of the burning ship. I pulled out my compass and pointed the direction back to Portsmouth. "Due east!" I pointed the way. "Keep a hard pace." I just wanted to get everyone left away from the burning ship and this whole chaotic mess. The ship was the primary light source now. It was a flaming pillar of screams and nightmares. I wasn't sure whether the men were luckier to burn or encounter the monsters that lurked the decks amidst the flames. The men paddled hard, and it seemed we were moving away from the ship at a good pace, but then the light from the sea came aglow, and it was all around us. The intensity of it was blinding. It was as though the very water itself had been reborn as a star. But as I looked over the edge of the lifeboat, I could see that this wasn't the case. There was something in the water, some massive structure that bubbled and burned even beneath the sea. It looked to be made of metal, but I had never seen anything so big made entirely of metal before. It would have fit my ship inside with no difficulty many times over. There was writing upon its outside, but not in a language I recognized. "Is it a sunken ship?" one of the other men in the raft asked. "Not one of ours, that's for sure." I looked over and saw that Mr. Travis was standing at the opposite side of the boat. He was looking out over the side before he turned back over his shoulder and looked at me. The light reflected in his eyes, making them look like two black marbles, though it was just a matter of the shadows being cast by the bright light below us. It had to be. "Look, Captain." He turned and pointed. "There's a place to land over there." Where he pointed, there was a pulsing light of dark red, and there did appear to be something at the surface there. It made me feel uneasy, though. No, I spoke firmly. We should follow the compass east. Sir? One of the men near me asked, looking up at me. Are we still going east? I looked down at my compass again. The needle was slowly shifting, as though it was floating without a firm cause. I turned it, and the needle swam about in a circle, not settling on any given point. Why was it doing that? We should land and get our bearings, my first called across the boat. The compass isn't working. I don't want to get lost at sea. That red light hung ominously to our port side, and we seemed to be drawing closer despite battling the other way. Seas be damned, I cursed quietly. Make for the red lights. We'll draw up there and gather ourselves, I said, deciding that Mr. Travis was right. We didn't want to paddle deeper out to sea. That was a death sentence as much as anything else. Sir, are you sure? One of the others in the boat asked. Everyone was looking at me as though my idea was insane, and for some reason that made me angry. Why were they questioning me? Travis had made it clear that this was a good idea, and with his opinion and mine for consideration, they should know better than to ask questions. Yes, I'm sure. Paddle hard. Let's get our feet on firm ground. I made the command firmer this time. My head was feeling a bit light, likely due to blood loss. The others looked back and forth amongst one another, but then they started to turn the boat and we were moving. There were so many screams in the air, rising up all around me. Did they come from the water, or were they from the boat I was in? It was impossible to tell. I tucked myself further into my coat. It wasn't long before we were drawing up upon the red lights, and the boat came aground, though not upon an island. We struck metal. The firm stopped knocking me down into the boat before someone helped me up again. I looked at this new madness with a critical eye. We were on a hill of metal, the surface smooth and slick-looking. There was a hole near the top of the hill, a hole or hatchway with a heavy door attached to it that was open. I disembarked, having the others join me. Bring the boat up and fasten it to that door, I ordered, not wanting to lose our ride. I turned around looking for Mr. Travis. I found our skilled craftsman first. I thought his name was Jiry. What is this thing? He asked quietly as he came up beside me. I don't think we should be here. We need a minute, Jiry. We have to figure out which direction will lead us back to the island. If we get lost out here in the longboat, then we're done. No one will ever find us, I told him, moving towards the door. The ground looked slick, but the metal, or whatever the material was, had a textured surface that seemed to hold my boots firm. I made it to the hatchway quickly enough. When I looked down inside the hatch, I found myself staring down a tunnel that dropped at least 100 feet, but it didn't look like any tunnel I'd seen before. This had clearly been built by something intelligent. It wasn't really a tunnel at all, but a hallway that was up on its end. There were doors off to the sides, and more of those ghost lights flickered along the hallway, lighting the whole stretch downward. It looked like there were even more tunnels branching off at the end of this, each meticulously identical, crafted with flawless precision and out of materials I couldn't identify. Mr. Travis, are you seeing this? I asked, expecting the man to have followed after me. Sir? Jiry asked. Yes, I replied, looking away from the tunnel and back to Jiry. I'm Len Jiry, sir, he replied, and I could see an anxiety upon the man. I know who you are, I snapped, my patience a bit more frayed than I had expected. Where is the first? Mr. Travis is... He cleared his throat. One of those things got him up on the ship, sir. He didn't make it to the boat. No, I just talked to him. I pushed past Jiry towards the other men, but there was no one there. It wasn't just Travis that was missing. It was everyone. Worse, the boat was gone as well. "Where's the cutter?" I asked, though I wasn't sure who I was asking. I turned back around to face Ogdry to ask him the same question, but Ogdry wasn't there. Instead, there was a man in black finery, with eyes as dark as the abyss of space, the blackest point between the furthest stars. His smile was too big, mouth full of too many teeth that were all as sharp as broken glass. "You," I said, my voice dry. He nodded, keeping his eyes on me, that smile never fading. "What are you? What is happening?" Desperation crept into my voice. I was confused and afraid, and I had never felt either of those emotions with the stinging clarity that I did in that moment. "I am many things, Captain, but you will know me as the Herald of the Darkness. I am the voice that comes before the answer to the question your people shouldn't have asked." He spoke in words that prickled at my mind, as though I heard them through the bleeding of my brain and not through any sound they made. He stepped towards me, and I tried to retreat, but found my body wouldn't move. He held up a small black sack with drawstrings. It seemed to radiate cold. "Take it," he urged, and I couldn't resist. I reached up and took the pouch from him, meaning to open it and look at what he had given me, but he clicked his tongue. No, you mustn't look inside. Some things weren't meant for mortal minds to see. You will deliver this thing for me, and you will take a message to your people." "I can't." My voice was fragile to my own ears. "I just can't." In the presence of this horror, I felt as though I might die in place, that my heart might explode in my chest, and that would be preferable to continuing this conversation. "Yet you will. It has already come to pass." He smiled again, the teeth in his mouth grinding together as he did so, making a sound like metal scraping over smooth stone. Then there was darkness, and forevermore, there would always be darkness. The three of us began the long walk back to our hotel. The breeze had died down, but dark, sinister-looking clouds hung menacingly overhead. "I don't think we're going to make it back to the hotel before those clouds open up on us," I commented.
"What do you want to do?"
my wife Heather asked, looking up at the clouds to see for herself. "I don't know. Keep walking?" I said. "A bit of rain never killed anyone." The sounds of screaming far off in the distance caught our attention.
"What's that, Mommy?"
our daughter Caitlin asked. Heather strained her eyes in the direction of the screams.
I don't know, honey. Maybe there was an accident."
Something off in the distance caught her eye.
"Do you see that, Rob? What is it?"
"I'm not sure." Heather appeared to be about to ask something when more screams, much closer this time, filled the air.
"Mommy, I'm scared.
"It's okay. Mommy and Daddy are here,"
I want to go back to the hotel."
Caitlin said, already pulling at her mother's arm.
"Can you tell where the screaming is coming from?"
Heather asked. "No, but it's stopped again. Think we should check it out?"
"No."
she said abruptly. "Maybe someone needs help," I said.
"I don't care. Let's go find some shelter. I don't like the look of those clouds."
"Okay, boss. Where to?"
"Look, over there."
Heather pointed.
"It's one of those tourist bus shelters. Why don't we ride out the storm in there?"
Without another word, we both grabbed Caitlin's hands and walked toward the shelter. Overhead, hundreds of crows quickly flew by as if they also wanted to escape the oncoming storm. That's when the screaming began in earnest. Without looking back, the three of us raced toward the shelter, not wanting to know what was going on behind us. As we ran, our surroundings darkened. The rain was closing in. The screaming seemed all around us as we ducked into the shelter. We were the only ones there, but we could see others in the distance making their way toward us.
"What is that racket?"
A voice inquired, startling the three of us. I turned around and noticed an older woman behind a glass partition. Above her, a sign read, "Bus tour tickets." "You work here?"
Yes, sir.
I asked.
Going to buy some tickets?
The woman asked. "No thanks, we're just trying to ride out the storm."
Sorry. This shelter is just for...
But before she could get the rest out, the sickening sound of frantic screams echoed through the shelter. The ticket woman opened the door to her booth and stepped out into the waiting room just as a couple of teenage girls came scurrying in.
Does anyone know what's going on?
One of the girls asked as she played with her phone.
I can't get any reception on my phone. Me either.
Her friend said, looking frustrated. I checked my phone and it wasn't picking up a signal either. The screaming stopped again just as suddenly as it began. The six of us turned and stared out toward the great wall of rain. The moisture in the air was increasing as the wall of rain moved closer. All of us had our phones out. "The storm must be interfering with our phones somehow," I said.
Have you ever seen anything like this?
The ticket woman asked. We shrugged.
I think the screams are coming from inside the rain.
One of the girls said.
Maybe the rain's really cold.
Caitlin offered. Everyone seemed pleased with that explanation.
That could be.
The other girl piped in hopefully.
Can anyone make out what's going on over there?
Heather asked.
It's too far for me to see anything.
Not me. Must still be about 7 or 8 blocks away, I answered.
Hold on a second.
The ticket lady said as she turned back to her booth.
I think I've got some binoculars back there somewhere.
I picked Caitlin up and walked over to some benches. Heather stayed where she was, hypnotized by the wall of rain headed our way. You okay? I asked Caitlin, giving her a reassuring hug.
I'm okay. We're safe in here, right?
You betcha. The ticket lady came back with a pair of ancient-looking binoculars in her chubby hands.
I knew I had them in here somewhere.
She said proudly.
Can you make out anything?
One of the girls asked. The ticket lady put the binoculars to her eyes and peered out towards the oncoming storm. Her fingers played with the focus gizmo as she muttered something under her breath. What is it? I asked. What do you see? I started to grow impatient with her constant fiddling and lack of information. I got up and stepped toward her as the binoculars slowly dropped from her face. She looked pale and her hands shook. I reached for the binoculars just as they slipped from her hands, crashing to the cement floor.
Impossible,
she whispered. I snapped up the binoculars and examined them for damage. When I saw they were still in good shape, I raised them to my eyes. I stood motionless as I looked toward the wall of rain. I too began to fidget with the focus, not believing what I was seeing.
Rob?
Heather said. I didn't answer, but instead played frantically with the focus.
Rob!
She tried again.
Tell us what you see.
Let me see, Daddy.
Caitlin asked. Screams filled the air. Horrible, grotesque, terrified screams.
I'm scared.
One of the teenage girls confided to her friend. More screams. It's the rain, I said to no one in particular. The sound of sobbing filled the shelter. I turned toward the sobbing and saw the ticket lady huddled against the plexiglass wall crying.
What's happening, Rob? Say something.
Heather pleaded. It's the rain, I said again. My voice sounded empty.
What about the rain? For God's sakes, tell us what's going on.
I lifted the binoculars again to have another look, as if what I had seen must have been a mistake. After staring off toward the rain for a moment, I brought the binoculars back down.
What did you see?
One of the teenage girls begged. The rain. It's melting them.
Melting who? What are you saying?
Heather asked. Heather finally took the binoculars for herself as I stood there dumbfounded.
We have to get out of here,
she said, dropping the binoculars. A man suddenly lurched into the shelter, collapsing to the hard cement floor. Everyone jumped in surprise as the 2 teenage girls screamed. Smoke drifted off his body and stank up the shelter. I broke from my trance and quickly knelt beside the man. You okay? I asked as I turned the man over. The man's face was burned and skin hung off him like melted wax. I felt bile rise in my throat. Screaming, the 2 teenage girls ran from the shelter in hysterics. "Wait, come back! You're running toward it!" I shouted, but it was no use. They didn't care or didn't hear me as they ran blindly from the horror they had just witnessed.
Stop them, Robert!
My wife begged me. "It's too late," I answered as I picked up the binoculars and placed them back to my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as if it was getting ready to burst right out of it. I watched in horror as the 2 girls ran wildly down the street. A splattering of rain hit them, and I watched helplessly as the 2 girls danced in sick, twisted movements, their arms flailing around as if to ward off whatever was attacking them. I continued to watch the gruesome display as the 2 girls collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. It was only seconds later, when the rain was fully on them, that the screams started in earnest. I watched as their young flesh melted away. Unexpectedly, one of the girls managed to crawl to her feet and began to slowly stumble back towards the shelter, her arms stretched out as if wanting a hug. The rain beat down on her harder and her clothes gave way, leaving nothing but a badly burned walking corpse. The girl made it only a few more steps before her body finally gave way from under her. I pulled the binoculars away from my face. I had had enough.
He's dead.
Heather proclaimed, startling me. "What?"
The man's dead.
She repeated, kneeling beside the man who had staggered in earlier. I dragged the body off to the side and draped it with my jacket.
Is this really happening?
The ticket lady asked as she pulled herself to her feet. "Yes," I replied, not even bothering to make eye contact.
We have to get Caitlin out of here.
Heather said. "To where?" I asked. "And end up like those 2? I motioned toward the girls. "We should stay put. Ride it out."
For God's sake, there's no door here. The rain will easily reach us.
"Not if we get to the back and stand on the benches."
But we could run in the opposite direction. Get somewhere with more protection.
"We can't risk it. We have no idea how fast the storm can move. We might only get a few hundred steps before it's on us." The 4 of us stood quietly, staring out toward the oncoming rain, no one saying a word. The rain was only a couple of blocks away now and closing fast. Heather latched onto Caitlin and held her tightly. The ticket lady sat slumped, head down, on one of the benches, crying. I stood by the doorway, staring intensely at this freak of nature and tried desperately to come up with a way to save us all. Gusts of wind blew into the shelter as droplets of the deadly rain started landing closer. As the rain slowly made its way towards us, the ugly smell of acidity began to permeate the shelter. From high above, the clouds, instead of being dark and menacing, took on a pleasant pinkish hue and rolled gently across the sky. But still it came. The sound of rain hitting the roof of our shelter marked the arrival of the storm at our doorstep. The ticket lady began to scream hysterically.
Stop it! You're scaring my child.
Heather bellowed at the woman, tightening her grip on Caitlin as if to protect her somehow from this crazy woman's screams. I rushed over to the woman, now crumpled in a fetal position, and tried to comfort her as best I could. "It'll be okay. We're all safe in here, and once the storm passes, we can go find help." I awkwardly tried to hold her in an attempt to comfort her, but she pushed me away.
"We're going to end up just like the rest of them."
She bawled.
Make her stop.
Heather begged. Would we make it out of this nightmare? I wondered. I turned my attention back to the ticket lady who had stopped crying and was now dragging herself pitifully along the ground toward the back of the shelter.
What do you think we should do?
Heather asked. I don't know, I answered honestly.
Come over and sit with us then. Caitlin wants you to sit with her.
I looked over my shoulder toward the shelter's entrance and noticed the rainwater starting to pool. So far it hadn't made its way in, but it was only a matter of time if this heavy downpour kept up. I placed a hand against one of the plexiglass walls and it was warm to the touch. I decided not to mention it and casually walked toward my wife and daughter. I sat beside Caitlin and put my arm around her. I rested my other hand on my wife's thigh and gave it a comforting squeeze. She looked at me and I could see in her eyes she was afraid. I tried to smile reassuringly. A few hours passed with no sign of the rain letting up. If anything, the rain came down harder than before. We had no visibility outside the shelter as the storm directed all its fury at us. The ticket lady hadn't spoken a word since her earlier outbreak. She sat huddled against the back corner opposite us. Her eyes stared off into space, absent of any spark of emotion. I started to wonder if perhaps she had snapped mentally and hoped she wouldn't cause trouble for us later. Of course, we had bigger problems to worry about. About an hour earlier, the rainwater had started to make its way into our shelter. A little bit at first, but it continued steadily until it covered almost one half of the shelter floor. We had watched in horror as the dead man's body, who I had placed off to the side earlier, began to dissolve before our eyes. Mercifully, the current dragged his body out of the shelter. There was about a 6-foot gap now between us and the water. I found a discarded newspaper under one of the benches and threw it onto the water to see what would happen. It sizzled immediately and disintegrated to nothing in seconds.
I hate not knowing what's going on out there. Is this happening everywhere, or is it just on top of us?
I wish I knew, I answered as I peered out into the rain. I placed one of my hands against the wall to test it again and found it hotter than before. I was thinking, what if we covered Caitlin up as best we can and I carry her in my arms and race over to the restaurant we passed earlier?
Are you nuts? You're not taking her anywhere, and you're not going anywhere either,
she said, sounding scared. I wanted to tell her about my fears of the shelter melting away around us and how the walls had been gradually getting hotter, but I saw no benefit in doing it, so I kept my mouth shut. A loud metallic snap followed by the sound of a splash caught my attention and made me almost jump out of my skin. The legs of one of the benches closest to the entrance had collapsed after being slowly melted away. When the bench finally collapsed to the floor, an acidic foam frothed around it as it began to dissolve. "Get Caitlin onto one of the benches. I want her away from the water," I ordered.
What about the booth?
Heather said. "Where?" I asked, concentrating more on the oncoming water.
The booth.
She repeated.
It's a good step above the floor of the shelter, and there's a small desk in there as well.
That's a great idea. I turned to face Heather, only to see the ticket lady scrambling toward the booth. "Hey, wait!" I called out. I ran toward her, almost knocking Heather and my daughter to the floor, but it was too late. The woman had the door open and was inside before I could make it to her. The door slammed shut in my face and I heard the click of the lock securing the door. "What are you doing? Open the door!"
There's no room in here for all of us,
she said through the door. I looked into the small booth and calculated it could at least hold one more adult and a child if put on the small desk. "You could fit another in there and one on the desk. Take my wife and daughter."
Do you take me for a fool?
She asked.
You don't think I know what you'll do if I open the door? 2 adults and a child might squeeze in here, but I'm guessing if I open the door, I wouldn't be one of those adults. Now would I?
"Don't talk nonsense. Of course you would. I'm willing to take my chances out here if I can protect my wife and daughter."
So you say.
I give you my word.
Save your breath. I'm not opening up. Besides, read the sign.
She pointed a fat finger above her head to a sign attached just above the booth's door. "Employees only." "Don't be an idiot! Open up!" I screamed at her as I pounded the door in a rage.
Get away from the door.
She said as she reached for something under the desk.
If you try to get in here, you'll be sorry.
The ticket lady held a sawed-off bat taped widely around its base. "You're nuts!" I told her, smashing the door with my fist one last time.
Stop it.
Heather called out.
Let her be. You're upsetting Caitlin.
I glared at the woman inside the booth and turned away to join my family. The water inched its way closer to the 3 of us, so we stepped on top of one of the last benches remaining. The water was only a foot away from us now. After watching the rate some of the other benches had dissolved, I guessed once the water was finally beneath us, we had about another 10 minutes before it too gave way. "We'll be safe here for a while," I said, keeping a close eye on the rising water. If we had taken the car, would we be in this mess? I wondered. Beating myself up over it wasn't going to help any of us, so I tried to push the thought from my mind. One of the plexiglass panels cracked from top to bottom. Caitlin screamed at the sudden noise. As the toxic rain continued to beat down on the weakened panel, web-like cracks began to splinter off from the main one.
Will it hold?
Heather asked, still trying to comfort Caitlin. I don't think for much longer, but it's far enough away from us that it shouldn't cause us any immediate problems, I answered. The temperature increased rapidly in the shelter. My shirt was drenched with sweat. The cracked panel finally gave way, cascading shards of broken plexiglass into the shelter. Rain poured in, quickly raising the water level.
We're going to die,
Caitlin cried, burying her face into her mother's chest. No one's going to die as long as we stay calm, I said. Others must know what's going on by now, and help has to be on its way. I squeezed Caitlin's shoulder, but I wasn't sure of our prospects anymore either. The water already licked at the front legs of the bench we were standing on. Heather looked at the woman in the booth.
For God's sake, open the door and at least let our daughter in.
The woman didn't respond. Instead, she looked away. There was still no reply from the woman.
I hope you die in there,
Heather yelled, just as something crashed down onto the roof of the shelter. Everyone jumped. I almost slipped off the bench because of the sudden start. I regained my balance and made sure I was on a more secure footing when I noticed the fine film of moisture on the bench. The heat from the water was making it sweat. Watch your footing, I said. The bench is getting slick. I looked around to see what happened and noticed a large tree branch hanging precariously above the ticket booth. The woman inside noticed it as well, and her smug look was gone. I craned my neck to see if there was any damage but couldn't make out anything. We're all fine. It's just a branch. I don't think there's any damage.
No, look,
Heather said, pointing toward the booth. A thin line of water streamed down the side of one of the booth's windows. The ticket lady, in a moment of panic, tried to stop the flow with some papers. She screamed out in pain as the water touched her skin. She jerked away in horror, holding her wounded arm, and tripped over something, forcing her to crash into the adjacent wall. The booth shuddered from her weight and the stream of water began to come down heavier. The ticket lady got to her feet almost immediately and tried frantically to get the door to the booth open, but it seemed stuck. I carefully moved my way along the bench toward the booth for a better look. I could feel the heat on the bottom of my feet. I took hold of my daughter, picked her up, and placed her behind me so I could get by. I maneuvered by my wife next. Careful, I cautioned her as I eased by. And grab hold of Caitlin. The bench is getting slippery. Almost at the edge of the bench, I saw why the door was stuck. Part of the ceiling where the branch had crashed down was pushed in and wedged against the top frame of the door. I also noticed some buckling of the outside wall. Stop yanking at the door. I think the door may be the only thing keeping the booth up. The shelter fell quiet.
What should we do?
Heather asked.
Can we help her?
I took another look at the ticket booth and the floor around it. There's nothing we can do for her. The water has already reached the door. We'd have to step into it to get to her. Heather didn't respond.
My feet hurt,
Caitlin cried. Give her to me, I said, holding out my hands. I'll carry her on my back for a while. Heather did as I asked, and I placed Caitlin on my back in a piggyback position. How are your feet feeling? I asked Heather.
Uncomfortable.
Can you handle it for a while longer?
Do I have a choice?
I didn't bother to answer. I turned back to the booth and saw the ticket lady standing there as if in shock. You okay in there? The ticket lady turned and looked at me.
I bet you're loving this.
She answered.
The old hag who wouldn't help got what's coming to her. Don't pretend to care if I'm okay or not. If you think that...
A loud moan floated through the warm, sweaty air of the shelter, cutting her off. It was the weight of the branch pushing down on the booth. The outside wall of the booth where it met the door sank a few more inches, allowing further trickles of water to seep in.
Is there nothing we can do?
Heather asked hopelessly.
Maybe we could...
I don't want any of your help or your stinking pity.
The ticket lady screamed at us from inside her flooding cell.
Take a good look around you. You're in worse shape than me. The water's almost up to the bench now. So save your tears, honey.
What's wrong with you? Are you insane?
Heather asked. The ticket lady started cackling to herself as if she had heard the funniest thing in the world. Don't worry about her. She must be in shock, I explained.
That's right, honey. Don't you go worrying about me. I'll be just...
The ticket lady screamed out as she whirled around, slapping her arms and head. Water streamed from the ceiling of the booth. She pushed herself against the far wall of the booth and nursed her burns, muttering quietly.
Are we gonna die, Daddy?
I told you already, no one is going to die. I snapped at my daughter in frustration, making her cry. I'm sorry, Pumpkin. Daddy didn't mean to be cross. It's just that it's so hot in here. But Caitlin didn't buy it and continued sobbing as she buried her face into my shoulder. Suddenly, we heard a loud splash. Was the shelter finally falling apart? The water began to lap onto the top of the bench. We heard another splash and what sounded like engines. The roar got louder. The water around us started to ripple, and small waves lapped at our feet, melting the soles of our shoes from under us. Out of the dense rain, 2 huge vehicles appeared, equipped with spotlights. Beams of light scanned the area as they moved along, and Heather and I screamed for help. One of the beams penetrated our disintegrating shelter. The second vehicle panned its spotlight over as well, almost blinding us. An amplified voice called out,
How many are you?
4, we screamed over the deafening racket.
Stay where you are. We're going to get as close as we can.
The large vehicles caused the water to splash up against our legs.
I don't know if I can stand it anymore.
Heather sobbed in pain. Just hang in there. We're okay now. The ticket lady started to slam her body against the door, which in turn caused more waves in the water.
Stop it, you bitch!
Heather screamed. The water burned into our calves and ankles as one of the vehicles pulled up to the shelter. The voice over the loudspeaker boomed.
We've positioned our side door to the entrance. You have to make it to us on your own. Can you do it?
I can't do it.
Heather said with a sob. Of course you can. It's less than 20 steps.
You saw what happened to the others. I just don't think that...
A sudden gush of steaming hot air blasted our faces, and the shelter around us shuddered. A horrific crash brought our attention back toward the ticket booth. Part of the ceiling had given way, and water flooded quickly into the booth. The ticket lady screamed in pain and threw herself against the walls frantically. The water was already up to her hips and then quickly to her midriff.
Turn Catherine away!
Heather ordered. I managed to turn Caitlin away just in time. The water lifted the ticket woman's thrashing body and pressed it against the window directly behind us. The ticket lady's clothes burned away as her flesh bubbled red as a lobster in boiling water. She went under a few times, reappearing each time with less and less hair until she was finally bald and her scalp racked with blisters. Eventually, the water reached the ceiling and the ticket lady became completely submerged and melted away before our eyes. The water then started to spill over the top of the booth and into the shelter. We have to do it now, I said.
You go first and take Caitlin.
No, we go together.
I'm so scared.
Heather cried uncontrollably. Take Caitlin, I told her.
No, I can't.
Take her, I said again, taking Caitlin from my back and handing her to Heather.
No, Robert, please don't do this.
Just take her and put her on your back. I pushed Caitlin onto her, and Caitlin instinctively grabbed for her mother and wouldn't let go. Heather gave in and helped Caitlin into position. I took a deep breath and stepped into the churning water and gritted my teeth as a hiss of pain escaped from between my clenched lips. Climb onto my back and for God's sake, hold tight to Caitlin. The pain was almost unbearable, and I wondered if I was going to be able to pull this off. I felt the sudden extra weight of my wife and daughter as they climbed onto me. Hurry, I don't know how much longer I can last. I looked quickly toward the booth. The ticket lady floated eerily in the bloody water. The water seemed to be alive around her as it filled with piranhas quickly devouring their prey. With my wife and daughter clinging desperately to me, I stumbled my way to the waiting vehicle in safety. With each step, I felt bits of my feet dissolve away. I didn't look down for fear of what I might find. With only a few steps left, I was almost sure I had nothing left but stumps, but I somehow forced myself on. I made out the opening in the vehicle and pushed myself forward. I carefully turned myself around and a pair of hands from within the vehicle appeared and grabbed Caitlin and pulled her in. What seemed to be almost an eternity of pain ended with Heather being dragged to safety as well. I felt myself begin to collapse from exhaustion and pain into the deadly water, but it didn't matter now that my family was safe. As I felt myself start to drift into unconsciousness, a pair of hands grabbed me and dragged me into the safety of the vehicle. The trapdoor to the vehicle slammed shut. The mechanized machine slowly pulled away as the entire shelter collapsed into nothing but food for the churning water. The ticket lady, now nothing more than a flowing ebb of blood and small bits of flesh, disappeared into the bubbling, destructive force of nature. Although I didn't know it yet, I'd never walk again without artificial support. But at least my family and I were alive, and I would live out my days knowing I was a hero in my daughter's eyes. What more could a father ask for?
Just south of Heidelberg sits Blackwater Swamp. Travel far enough in and you'll find the Harlow estate. There's no local legends or ghost stories about it, and if you were to ask any of the locals about the estate, you'd come to the conclusion that no one cares. The Harlow estate is, or rather was, a large 2-story house that sits on a private island. Over the years, local kids started using the place to throw wild parties. That became sort of a tradition that lasted for years till a particularly nasty hurricane season essentially destroyed the place. Slowly but surely it was abandoned and left to rot away in the swamp. Even though most people ignored it, my friends and I still went there from time to time. There were 3 of us, Victor, Willie, and me, Carl. The swamp wasn't the safest place. Alligators, wild hogs, snakes, and spiders were the usual, but we were used to it. It was the summer of our senior year in high school, and we had all graduated and wanted to throw one last party at the estate before life pulls us away. Vic was in charge of beer and weed, Willie was bringing his hunting gear, and I was borrowing my cousin's airboat. The plan was to invite a bunch of people, but we kind of forgot we weren't what you'd consider popular. Of course, no one showed up, which was fine with me, but now we were stuck with way too much beer and nowhere near enough weed. Cracking the cap of a fresh beer, Willie stood and raised his drink. Before he could spit out some corny toast, we started throwing rocks at him. "Boo!" Vic called out. "If you say one more word, I promise you're swimming back," he added, nudging me and laughing at the look on Willie's face. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we were drunk. Right about here is where I had the genius idea of going inside the house to get some photos. The walk from our camp to the estate took a little longer than it should have, but considering how blitzed we were, I'm surprised we made it at all. As the estate came into view, we were shocked at how bad it looked. Creeping vines had overtaken the front of the house, snaking their way up the walls and pouring in through the broken windows. The old wrought iron fence was a rusted heap nearly hidden by piles of debris from the flooding. Chugging the last of his beer, Willie tossed the can, then aimed his flashlight at me. I say since this your idea, you go in first." Before I could say anything, Vic seconded the motion, then shoved me towards the path leading in. Laughing it off, I shrugged and turned my attention to the house. The place was a mess. Most of the roof was missing, and what was there had collapsed. By the looks of it, we wouldn't be in there long. As soon as I stepped onto the path, I noticed the ground was soft. I didn't see anything out the ordinary till we were near the front steps. There were clusters of red-capped mushrooms growing on every inch of exposed concrete. We literally had to walk through them to reach the front door, and by the time I stepped inside, I looked like a powdered donut. Taking a moment to dust myself off, I looked around. Murky black water stood knee-deep throughout the first floor. I could hear something splashing around. I guessed it was a frog or something, 'cause it didn't sound big. Straight ahead of me, I could see the main stairway was still standing strong, but there was something wrong. On the second-floor landing, there was a statue of a woman with what I thought was a child standing next to her. Focusing my light on it, I paused. The thing standing next to her was a creature. From the waist down, it was an alligator, and from the waist up, it was a human. But the face was a horrible combination of the two. Its oblong skull was lumpy and deformed, with features I couldn't clearly define as human or gator. Slightly stammering through my words, I called to the others. "Hey, do you guys remember a statue in here?" There was a long moment of silence before Vic poked his head in and froze when he saw what my light was on. "Whoa, where'd that come from?" he asked, stepping inside while motioning for Willie to follow him. Once we were all standing there, Willie laughed.
Hey, you gotta be fake. Who'll go through the trouble of putting something like that up?
Our combined drunk logic said he was right, and to prove it, Vic sloshed through the water, then climbed up the stairs to see for himself. "Damn, this thing is creepy," he called back to us before trying to shove the statue. When it didn't budge, he stepped back, scratching at his neck. "Holy shit, it's a real statue." Wanting to get a look, Willie joined him, leaving me standing by the door. The layout of the place hadn't changed much. Other than the smell and the water, the hall to my left was partially blocked off by a collapsed ceiling. The large room to my right was overgrown by the vines coming in through the window, and small clusters of those mushrooms. From what I could see, the hall leading to the kitchen was clear. The water would be deeper there, but it led to the back of the house. I was pretty sure the second floor was useless. There wasn't much there to start, so we weren't missing anything. We goofed around for a while, taking pictures and recording video for Willie's YouTube channel, then made our way to the kitchen. From there, we could take the back door to the garden so we could see if our wheat plants survived. Technically, they weren't our plants. Over the years, lots of people planted seeds. It was another one of those traditions that started long before we ever saw this place. Aside from the garden, there were 3 smaller buildings behind the main house. No one ever used them because they were falling apart. The odds were there wasn't much left. By the time we made it to the kitchen, the water was waist deep. It didn't take long to realize a flaw in our plan. Standing water is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and we were being eaten alive every step of the way. Making matters worse, there was so much debris piled against the back of the house we couldn't get the door open. After searching for a few minutes, I found a hole in the wall big enough for us to go through, but we had to crawl, and that meant being underwater for a few seconds. It was obvious this was a blank trip. There was no way anything survived, but we did it anyway. I went through last. While I was waiting for Vic to clear the hole, there was a splash from somewhere behind me. Glancing back to the hall, a ripple rolled across the water coming towards me. I didn't see anything, but I knew there was something there. Quickly checking to see if the way was clear, I hurried through to catch up to the others. The second I stood up, Willie tapped me. "Don't move," he muttered as I wiped the water from my face. When my vision cleared, my jaw dropped. There was a massive uprooted tree lying in front of us, but that wasn't the problem. What had to be 100 swamp rats were perched on top of it, staring down at us. Moving slowly, Vic eased over and whispered, "I think we should get back inside." As the words left his lips, the rats started jumping in the water. The next thing we knew, we were under attack. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, watching the beady-eyed horde swim towards us. In a mad scramble, we dove back through that hole and tore ass through that house. We ran all the way back to our campsite. Stinking of stagnant water and covered with mosquito bites, we stood there stumped, staring at nothing. Our boat was gone, and the camp was trashed. "Jack's gonna kill me! How am I supposed to tell him his boat got stolen?" I blurted out excitedly while pointing to where it had been. Walking up to the edge of the water, Willie replied,
"Fuck Jack! How are we getting home?"
The realization that we were stranded landed like a bomb. We had our phones, but there was no cell service in the swamp. The three of us stood there silently looking at what was left of our camp. Whoever had done this hadn't taken our supplies, but they were scattered on the ground. Willie's hunting gear was intact. There were 3 life vests and 2 overturned coolers. Aside from the boat problem, things could have been worse. Turning over one of the coolers and taking a seat on it, Vic shook his head. "If this is a joke, it ain't funny," he said before picking up a beer, cleaning it off and opening it. "I bet it was the Gentrys. They've been after us since last year." The Gentrys, Adam and Thomas, the year before we'd trapped them in a shipping container with a skunk. In our defense, it had been payback for them locking me in a porta toilet and pushing it over. Scooping up a beer for myself, I glanced over at Willie. He was picking up the life vest and mumbling something to himself. Shrugging it off, I wiped the can clean, opened it, and took a sip. Nah, if it was them, we'd know it by now. They'd have stuck around just to rub our noses in it. Besides, those 2 are dumber than dirt. I don't think they could come up with a prank this good. Vic nodded in agreement, then took a drink. We batted a few more ideas around, but Willie had been oddly silent. The entire time we'd been talking, he'd been staring out at the swamp with the life vest in his hands. "Hey, what you doing?" Vic asked, trying to get his attention. Without responding, Willie slipped the vest on, then started walking towards the water. Seeing what he was doing, we snapped into action. We managed to catch him just as his feet got wet. But the moment one of us touched him, he started yelling,
"Let me go! I can't stay here!"
He was frantic. It took the 2 of us to drag him away from the water, and he fought us the entire time. He wouldn't calm down. We literally had to pin him to the ground till he gave up. When he finally stopped fighting, he kept muttering,
"I can't stay here. I can't stay here,"
while rocking in his seat. I kept an eye on him while Vic got a fire started. Then we took turns watching him till we eventually fell asleep. I couldn't tell you how long I was out, but the fire was still burning, so it couldn't have been long. I lay there staring up at the stars for a while. The crackling of the flames mixed with the sounds of the swamp was almost hypnotic. For a moment I forgot just how screwed we were. Then I heard something in the distance. At first it was faint, but as I focused it became clear. A voice called out,
"Help! Please, somebody help me!"
I sat up looking around, but I didn't see anyone. Getting to my feet, I made sure Willie was still asleep. He and Vic were out cold, so I knew it wasn't one of them, but the voice was still there. Moving slowly, I went to the water's edge and looked further out. That's when I saw someone. There was a kid splashing around in the water. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but by the looks of it, whoever they were in trouble. Kicking off my boots, I rushed in and started swimming out to help. As I got closer, the splashing stopped and the voice went silent. There was no point in diving under to find them. The water was murky in broad daylight. At night, it would be like trying to see through mud. I swam out to the exact place I'd seen the kid, but there was nothing there. There wasn't much I could do, and being in the water after dark was dangerous, so I turned to start swimming back. I'd made it close to halfway when the voice cried out from behind me.
Help!
Good thing I was in the water, because I'm pretty sure I pissed myself when I turned and saw what was there. Maybe 10 feet away from me, I saw someone staring at me. The top of the person's head was sticking out of the water, but it wasn't moving.
Are you okay?
I called out, but there was no reply. The moment I made a move towards it, the head dipped below the water. I'd seen enough. I turned away and started swimming back to shore as fast as I could. I'm a decent swimmer, so I figured whoever it was wouldn't be able to catch me. But I was wrong. Something slammed into me, and a surge of pain shot up my left leg. Everything happened so fast I didn't have a chance to react. I was snatched under and immediately spun head over heels. My first thought was death row. A gator had me and I was about to be ripped apart. I felt my shin snap under the pressure as my body was ragdolled to the point I couldn't tell up from down. Fear flooded my body like the swamp water that was filling my lungs, and I blacked out. I guess the commotion woke the others because the next thing I knew, Vic was pulling me out of the water.
What the fuck were you doing out there?
He asked before seeing my mangled leg.
Holy shit. Don't move. I'll be right back.
Hopping to his feet, Vic hurried past Willie, who was sitting up, scratching the side of his face and muttering to himself. Still groggy, I puked up some water, then glanced down at my leg and started screaming. The skin of my shin had been stripped away, revealing broken bones and shredded muscle. I hadn't realized to that moment that I couldn't feel my leg. By the time Vic got back with the first aid kit from Willie's bag, I was in full panic mode. Once he finally got me still enough to bandage me up, I blacked out again. When I came to, Vic was sitting by the fire. He was bloody from setting my leg and he looked exhausted, but Willie was gone.
Where'd he go?
I asked as I sat halfway up supporting myself with my elbow. Closing his eyes and tilting his head back, Vic took a deep breath and tried to calm himself.
While I was working on your leg, he took off. Before I could stop him, he put on that dumbass vest and got in the water. He wouldn't come back. I tried to get him to turn around, but he just kept going. What was I supposed to do? You were bleeding all over the place. I couldn't leave you there and go after him.
Flopping back down, I tried to focus. My head was spinning and I felt sick. For the time being, I decided not to say anything about the kid I saw in the water. It would just add more problems, and all I wanted to do was go home. The sun would be up soon. Even though no one came to the estate anymore, there were a few guys that fished in the area, so there was a chance we'd get spotted if we stayed put. Since technically I didn't have a choice, staying where we were made sense. As the morning rolled in, I almost wanted to cry. Thick gray clouds hung high in the sky. Rain was coming. Great, I muttered to myself before glancing over at Vic. He hadn't moved since I woke up. Can't say I blame him. This whole situation was out of control, and by the look of it, about to get worse. Thunder rumbled across the sky as the first few drops started to fall. Looking up, laughing sarcastically, Vic threw up his hands.
Oh, come on, man, seriously. What the fuck is wrong with you? Go away!
He shouted at the clouds while fanning both hands to the side as if he were clearing them out. In most cases, this would seem strange, but that's Vic. Ever since we were kids, he talked to the clouds. He said it was something his granny taught him. There's good clouds and bad clouds. The good ones listen and the bad ones do what they want. He'd say it every time he saw rain coming. Shrugging his shoulders, he turned his attention to me. We can't be this close to the water. Looks like the bad clouds are here to stay. As much as I didn't want to risk moving, I knew he was right. The water rises fast in the swamp. It could go from bad to worse in a heartbeat. The only thing we had going for us was Willie's hunting gear. Aside from the first aid kit, he had brought his .22 long rifle with extra ammo in his pack. There were also a few cans of corned beef, Spam, and chili, along with some flares and a map of the area. I remember making fun of him for bringing all that stuff to a party, but I was glad he had done it now. Hoping the rain would pass through, we opted to take shelter a little further in, beneath the hanging moss trees. After an hour, it was clear the rain wasn't letting up. Vic yawned and leaned back against a tree. I don't think anyone's coming. Not right now, at least. Maybe we should move inside. It might not be perfect, but we'd be dry. He had a point. Besides, even if someone were to come by, they wouldn't have seen us under the trees. Going inside was probably the best choice. Once he had gathered the gear and helped me up, we made our way to the house. Somehow the rain made the place look creepier than it had before. Thinking about swarming mosquitoes and hordes of swamp rats almost made me change my mind. Look, we made it to the Mushroom Kingdom, Vic said jokingly as he helped me up the stairs. Every step we took released a cloud of spores. The rain kept it down, but it was still sticking to us as we crossed through the doorway. Once we were inside, he sat me next to the opening, then flopped down a few feet away. We were wet and cold. It was a miserable situation, but being inside was a hell of a lot better than sitting under a tree. After a short rest, Vic got up and started looking around. I'm gonna go look for some dry wood. We might be able to get a small fire going, he said, getting to his feet and stretching. There was no point in arguing. It wasn't like I could stop him. I watched him search for a moment before I noticed something was different. The statue of the creature wasn't there anymore. I think there's someone else here, I said, pointing to where it had been. Vic paused and looked for himself, then scratched his head. Well, if someone else is here, they need to get their asses in gear and help us, he replied before yelling, You hear me? Get out here and give us a hand. He stood there silently for a moment before shouldering the rifle and pointing it to the stairs. I'm going to the second floor. There might be something we can use up there. Hang tight, I'll be right back. I watched as he sloshed through the murky water, then made his way up to the next floor. Once he was out of sight, I sat there listening to the thunder, trying not to think about the throbbing pain from my leg. I couldn't help but wonder about Willie. That was a long swim, and now that it was raining, the odds were he hadn't made it very far. As that thought crossed my mind, Vic came bounding down the stairs, carrying a metal wash tub he had filled with bits of dry scrap wood. Bingo, gringo! We've got action, he announced, holding up his haul so I could see it. I was surprised he had found anything, but having a fire to warm us up felt like the best idea ever. After poking a few holes in the wash tub, Vic piled the scraps in and lit the fire. We sat tossing in extra pieces till the flames were high enough to make a difference, then got comfortable and watched the rain. Eventually, Vic fell asleep. For the first few minutes, I couldn't take my eyes off the statue. There was something so familiar about her face. She reminded me of a picture I'd seen somewhere, but I couldn't place it. A loud splash from the hall caused me to look in that direction. We hadn't had a chance to see what was down there, but from what I could remember, it was the dining room. Out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn the statue moved. It was a slight turn of her head, but when I looked, it hadn't budged. Wincing and laughing at myself, I rubbed my leg, trying to ease the pain. There were dark veins spreading up my thigh, and it was warm to the touch. I was pretty sure it was infected. Letting out a sigh, I leaned back, propping myself up against the wall. It was getting harder to stay calm, but panicking wasn't going to make things any better. Time passed slowly as I watched the water rising. We were going to need to move to higher ground if it kept up, and the only place I could think of was the landing where the statue was standing. A part of me was hanging on to the hope that Willie made it and was on the way back with help. The rest of me just hoped he wasn't dead. Closing my eyes and tilting my head back, I tried to relax. The squeaking of a rat changed that instantly. More out of surprise than fear, I turned and spotted it was swimming towards us. Wood rats are big bastards to begin with, but these were huge. From a distance, I'd swear it was a possum. The minute I laid eyes on it, more of them came swimming out of the hall, sounding off. As the squeaks and squeals filled the air, I tried to wake Vic, but he wouldn't move. I had to get the rifle. Using my arms and one good leg, I dragged myself to where it was sitting. Praying for a good shot, I grabbed it, turned and fired without aiming. I missed. The lead rat climbed out of the water and rushed me as I checked another round, then fired. It was a hit, but it didn't matter. As the one fell, 3 more took its place, and behind that another dozen with more on the way. All I could do was cover myself as the horde stampeded over us. Dozens of them clawing and scrambling for the door. They weren't attacking. They were running, and we were in the way. When it was over, and the last of them vanished into the rain, an eerie calm settled in. Vic was sound asleep. I thought he was dead till he stirred a little, then started snoring. Laughing and shaking my head, it dawned on me. The rats were running away from something. Shit, I muttered. There were 8 shots left. Once I reloaded, I tried waking Vic again. "Get up, man. We gotta go. There's..." The sound of something big splashing around in the kitchen cut me off. I could hear it bumping against the walls of the hall for a moment, then it stopped. Loud sniffing followed by a low growl forced me to swallow the lump in my throat as I took aim. If it was a gator, the rifle wouldn't stop it unless I hit its soft spot at the base of its skull. That meant I'd have to be either standing or above it. I was fucked. I kept waiting for a massive gator to come charging in, but nothing happened. I wasn't about to stick around. I knew there was something in that hallway even though I couldn't see it. The door was a few feet away. I could possibly drag myself out, but there was no way I could leave Vic. Scooting to the door, I placed the rifle outside, then turned back and grabbed him by the arms. It was going to take a lot, but it had to be done. I strained and pulled using my right leg to help, and managed to get us both halfway through the door. That's when it attacked. The first thing I saw was its head. An elongated mass of flesh, colored scales emerged from the water, snapping its jaws and reaching out with almost human-looking hands. I was still pulling at Vic's arms, trying desperately to drag him out, but it was too late. The creature grabbed him by the legs and snatched him away, causing me to fall back, landing in a bed of mushrooms. I was instantly engulfed by a cloud of spores. My eyes were burning and I couldn't breathe. Gasping for air, I sat up in time to see that thing bite into Vic's hip and tear off his leg before dragging the rest back in the water. Rubbing spores from my eyes, I reached for the rifle and froze when I heard rustling from the bushes to my right. There was just enough time for me to glance in that direction. A smaller version of what I had just seen launched itself at me. I felt it grip my shoulder and wrist, forcing my arm straight while simultaneously biting down on it. There was a loud crunch and my fingers went numb as the little bastard landed, then immediately went into a death roll. All I could do was gasp. It happened so fast my brain hadn't processed the pain. As the creature rolled for the first time, the momentum slammed me face first into the ground, knocking out my front teeth. The second roll snapped bone and tore tendons to shreds. The third took everything from the elbow down. The creature backed away, eating, while I flopped around, spraying blood and screaming at the top of my lungs. It finished my arm and was about to attack when a shot rang out. It snarled at me, then quickly turned and scrambled away, vanishing in the overgrown brush. Gunfire echoed around me as the pain kicked in and my body shut down. The last thing I saw was Sheriff Landry, standing over me looking down. I was in a coma for 3 days and in the hospital for a month. I lost my arm. They had to amputate my leg due to infection, and my friends were dead. According to the doctors, the spores we inhaled caused us to hallucinate. We'd gotten dosed and stumbled into an alligator's nesting area. I told them about the creatures and the statues. They said the statue of the woman was an art exhibit from Crimson Creek, which is a town east of Blackwater Swamp. They showed me pictures. I instantly recognized it, but there was no creature with her. When I asked about it, I was told it had to have been a hallucination brought on by the spores. The more they explained everything, the more I started to believe their version of what happened. As it turns out, Willie was the reason they found me. His mangled torso was discovered by fishermen. The life vest had my cousin's info written in it, so they contacted him. Jack told them where we had gone. They found his airboat not far from where they had found Willie. All they recovered of Vic was his head and one of his legs. When it was all said and done, the whole thing was written up as a horrible accident. When I finally got out the hospital, I slipped into a deep depression. Both families blamed me for the deaths, and I had to agree. It was my idea. They died because of me. Months passed before I finally looked through my phone. The photos and videos were still there. One photo in particular brought my world to a screeching halt. It was a picture I'd taken of Willie and Vic standing by the two statues. The thing that made my heart drop was the fact that the light from my camera's flash reflected in the creature's eyes. It wasn't a statue. It had been right in front of us, and we were too drunk to see it. In the video, I literally saw it turn to look at us. I posted everything online and told everyone that would listen, but no one believed me. They thought I was trying to make money off the death of my best friend. That led me to do some research on the creature itself. All I found were some pictures of Jack the Alligator Man. No one's been able to help me, and most people think I've gone crazy. The only person that believes me is my cousin Jack, but everyone thinks he's crazy, so having him on my side doesn't help much. He wants me to go back there. That's not happening. There's no combination of words known to man that could convince me to set foot in Blackwater again. Since I refused to go, Jack said he's going out there alone. His plan is to torch the estate and kill anything he finds. I've been trying to talk him out of it, but he won't listen. The only thing stopping him right now is his airboat. It was badly damaged when they found it. The repairs should be finished next week. That buys me a little time. If I can talk him out of it, this will be my last post. If I can't, this will still probably be my last post. It's been real. This is Carl Grant, signing off.
It was everything about the sea that had always unnerved him, waiting at the bottom in one cold, disintegrating hulk. Not 2 minutes earlier, Danny was in another world, the world above the waves, the world of air and land and the hot, dry feel of the summer sun. His wetsuit snug as a second skin, he sat on the cuddy boat's transom long enough to velcro a lanyard around his ankle, binding him to the safety line with 90 feet of slack. He cinched tight his goggles, round and insectoid, then slipped over the stern. Bobbing in sync with the hull, he sucked wind and huffed it out, cycling a few times before filling from the bottom up, belly, lower chest, upper chest, like trying to cram a stuffed suitcase with more and a little more on top of that. In the boat, against the lone cloud in the sky, Chemo held a stopwatch with his thumb on the trigger. Ready? Danny squeezed in one last sip of air and plunged head first, like a seal, full body undulations propelling him down, with the safety line trailing after. The swim fins helped. He'd not been blessed with big feet. They never made fun in Hawaii, but guys always made fun here on the mainland. Hey, Danny, with those dainty little Asian paws of yours, how do you manage to even stay up on a surfboard? Well, maybe they didn't mean anything by it. Or maybe they did, trying to get inside his head, psych him out. Small feet. Small. Yeah. He converted it to fuel. That much more drive to bring home a trophy, another sponsorship. But all that was a world away. He was in the blue world now, a gradient of cerulean to indigo yawning beneath him, where the farther down you went, the more the topside laws unraveled. Until he'd first experienced the shift for himself back in the spring, he had always believed the same as everyone else he brought it up with, that freediving was a non-stop struggle against your own buoyancy, fighting the lift of the air heaved into your lungs. Another misconception dies hard. It was like that for only the first 40 or so feet down. Make it that far, to what they called the doorway to the deep. And there came a transition he had yet to stop regarding with wonder. Buoyancy was neutralized, the weight of the water bearing down, nullifying your tendency to rise to the surface. No more struggle. The fight was won. The sea had you then, a downward pull he could feel tugging on his shoulders and skull. He held his arms along his sides, aquadynamic, and continued to descend, effortlessly now, like a skydiver, bulleting in freefall. The trickiest part had been learning how to equalize the pressure on his ears, in his sinuses, and turn back the pain. The deeper he sank, the more the pressure became like the slow tightening of a fist that would never relax. It had taken some reframing of the changes it made, seeing them as comforting rather than distressing. This is what happens down here. This is normal. Another version of normal. No big deal. Just the mammalian dive reflex. Shifts of physiology so distinct, so foreign out of the water, so automatic in it. They could recalibrate a lifetime of thinking after a dive or two. Maybe we really do belong here. Despite the exertion, his heart rate slowed. Even before the threshold 40 feet down, his lungs were already compressed to half their normal size. At 60, they were reduced to a third. If he were acclimated enough to go that far, at 300 feet, his lungs would be no bigger than baseballs. Here, though, a couple miles out to sea, over a shelf of land jutting from the central Oregon coast, the bottom cut him off at a depth of 76. Almost there, he tucked into a ball and flipped head over tail, to finish dropping flippers first. He tucked down with a gentle bounce that stirred the silt amid a sparse garden of kelp and seaweed that swayed in the current. And all was so very quiet, like awakening to a dream world of slow time and profound tranquility. The need to breathe remained on some far horizon. The pressure was a cocoon, a presence as welcoming as a hug. All this time he'd been lying to himself, thinking he knew something about the ocean. And why? Because he'd grown up on an island? Because he'd first stepped onto a surfboard when he was 7 and had hardly stepped off since? That was how you fooled yourself into believing you truly understood the sea when all you'd ever done on a board was scratch the water's surface. Above, the day was clear, bright and sunny. Down here, the sun still found him, but was filtered to a murky twilight, as if the fog of morning and blue of evening had joined to wrap around and welcome him home. It took slow moments to take shape. A mass off to his left, a ragged, edgeless hill rising from the sea floor. Danny moved toward it in fin-encumbered hops, a feeling maybe like walking on the moon. He hadn't gotten close enough to satisfy his curiosity before his tether to the surface ran out of slack. The dumbest thing in the world would be to strip the lanyard from his ankle. He did it anyway, fearing if he didn't get close enough for a look now, he might never find the spot again. He left the safety line behind and was truly diving free. The mass was no longer edgeless, and no hill. A hill wouldn't have 2 masts jutting down from one side to dig into the sea floor. A hill wouldn't have rectangular openings, nor broken windows, metal railings, cleats still wrapped with decaying rope. It was somebody's lost sailing yacht, a 50-footer at minimum, resting on its starboard side. The build was old school, lots of wood where most buyers would have been content with aluminum and fiberglass. Now, it was an ecosystem, submerged long enough to have sagged into itself and crushed over with rot and life. The cold found him through his wetsuit and went for his marrow. Shipwrecks had always bothered him, even from the safety of pictures. Planes lost at sea, too, and sunken cars, and houses and timber groves and valleys flooded to make new lakes. It was more than the tragedies and calamities they told of. It was their status, things perfectly normal in the topside world. Aliens now, lost and alone, where they were never meant to be. They were a rebuttal. You're lying to yourself, you know? It's the hypoxia talking. You think you belong. This isn't your element at all. Regardless, the wreck drew him in until he was close enough to touch it. Everything down here is so much better suited to belong than you. Here, all you are is a resource. Breathing? Soon. The pent-up need, he now understood, wasn't driven by a lack of oxygen. The body had no sensors for that. An amazing oversight. Nobody would ever design an oxygen-powered machine that way on purpose. Down here, your food. All you have to do is wait. Instead, the clawing need to breathe came from a buildup of carbon dioxide, and you could hack that to a degree. He let a poof of stale air slip his lips, and it bought him a little more time. He squatted and gripped the yacht's tilted gunwale to shove off it and launch his ascent. But to his surprise, it gave way with a muffled crunch, and a cloud of debris, crumbs and shards of rotten wood drifting loose. It was what was inside that really gave him a jolt. The cross-section of wood appeared tunneled, the burrows full of soft, pale bodies. Worms, they looked like. Some as short and thin as matches, others the size of a finger, one as plump as a cigar. Danny vented more CO2, this time not meaning to, a sound of disgust burping loose, and he'd been down too long, his vision starting to close around the edges with the height of a 7-story building left to swim. He pushed off the bottom and kicked toward the beckoning daylight. If your vision began turning to a haze they called the pink cloud, that was when you really had to worry. What came next was a blackout, and he feared it was moments away. The resetting of the clock to a final countdown. You could drift unconscious for a couple minutes, no harm done, your larynx automatically closing like a valve to keep the water out. Up top, they would know before it opened again, if they were paying attention. You just had to trust your team. They'd realize you were in trouble, haul you up by a safety line. Oh. Right, shit. He kicked harder. Which came first then? The movement out in front of him? Or the movement he felt through him? Through, probably. Yeah, go with that. His insides felt stirred, quivering as if he'd hugged a vibrator. Right away he knew what it was. He'd felt the same thing from dolphins. Echolocation. A ping of sonar developed over millions of years of evolution. So advanced it made the Navy's best look like a toy. But this was no dolphin. If a dolphin was a whisper, what he'd felt was a bark. He lowered his gaze from the beacon of the sun and back to the deep blue haze. 20, 30 yards out it was dimly visible. A darker bulk against the murk. A slick, bulbous head and a body stretching too far back into the gloom to make out. With his vision closing down, Danny could barely see it anyway, and only for a moment before it faded into a wash of pink. He heard a muffled thump and the sensation enveloped him again. If you're lucky and you know it, clap your hands. Whatever was out there could have obliterated him without trying. Sperm whales? Loudest animals on Earth. Their clicks could be so loud they couldn't even exist in the air as sound. They could blow out your eardrums, maybe kill you as surely as the concussive blast of a bomb. Lucky, it was only scanning, giving him a sonogram. Kicking again with legs starting to feel like tingling rubber, nearly blind now, he rose toward a total eclipse of the sun. A few feet from the surface he spewed a gush of bubbles to empty his aching lungs. Then, with a titanic whoosh, broke through into the glorious air.
You stupid motherfucker!
Kimo was peering down from the boat as if he were looking at a ghost. Things started going clear again, even the sweat spraying from Kimo's shaved head as he whipped the lanyard at the end of the rope, like shaking a leash at a naughty dog.
What is this? What the fuck is this?
My bad? Didn't quite cut it under the circumstances, did it?
What? Almost drowning once this year wasn't enough for you? You thought you'd find another way?
Treading water, Danny peeled off his goggles and flipped his hair back from his face to splat against his shoulders.
Sorry, man. I needed more than 90 feet. But you stopped moving.
Kimo jabbed a finger toward the sonar screen.
It still makes you dumb as a rock. But if you kept moving, you wouldn't have sent me from 0 to panic mode, hauling this up, and you're not on the end of it anymore.
He flung the safety line to the deck.
I was 2 seconds from going in after you.
But I started moving again. Obviously, you didn't see that?
I'm giving myself 90 feet of rope burns. No.
I don't multitask. The man had been looking out for him for years, one displaced Hawaiian to another, and his anger was so pure, so righteous, so Kimo. Danny couldn't help but laugh. It was the right thing at the right time. Same as below, the body knowing what to do, and doing it.
I was fine, really.
He took Kimo's hand and clambered over the side into the boat, then tapped the sonar.
How about the whale? You see the whale?
For a moment, Kimo could only blink. Translation? Good going, asshole. Now you made me miss an entire whale, too.
You saw a whale?
Just for a second or two. My vision was going, so...
Are you sure you weren't hallucinating?
I felt him check me out. I didn't hallucinate that. He turned a clumsy 360 to scan the waves for a breach, but saw nothing. How long was I down? I think you were around 245. 250 when I went for the line. I don't even know where the watch landed. Danny plopped onto the transom and wriggled out of his fins. So I had to break 3 minutes, easy. Nothing impressive by competition standards. Competitive freedivers could rack up depths and times that were off the chain. But those people were all about the numbers. The endurance. Not about merging with the sea. A new personal best and I don't even know what it is. He tossed his fins aside, then spotted the stopwatch beside their cooler of water bottles. He snatched it up and held it toward Kimo's face. Back to normal brown after all the furious brick red.
Check it, Danny said. 6:34 and counting.
Kimo rolled his eyes.
That'll look good on your tombstone. Still holding my breath, bitches.
Shipworms. That's all you saw when the wood came apart. Gale told him that afternoon. They're called shipworms. Danny didn't know whether to be fascinated or appalled. A whale? He could wrap his brain around that. Those aquatic grubs were something new. Shipworms? It's actually a thing? For someone who's eaten as many waves as you have, your sense of maritime history really is lacking. She gave him a peck on the cheek, as if to say she loved him anyway. Yeah, they're a thing. In the age of sailing ships before steel hulls, they were a big, bad, serious thing. Termites of the sea is the best way to describe them. If they weren't busy eating shipwrecks, they were causing them, or chewing through wharves, piers, anything like that, waiting for a nice juicy log to drift by to turn into a floating condo. Your home is your food, pretty much the definition of a parasite. Like taking a gander around this cliff-top cottage and thinking, hey, break me off a piece of that wall. I'm feeling peckish. What am I in the mood for? The green room? The blue room? Something in the line of a honey gold breakfast nook. Yum. But they're not actually worms. They're mollusks, like long skinny oysters. They've got little shells on the front. That's how they burrow in. She perked up. If you dive that wreck again, bring up a few. They're supposed to taste like clams. That's a bucket of nope right there. His stomach did barrel rolls at the thought. How do you know this? You don't even sail. That was the distinction between them. For all her astonishing symbiosis with the sea, Gale hardly ever got out on it. That was his department. Gale was perfectly happy being its next-door neighbor. She crossed her arms and, with a cockeyed grin, withered him with a glance. He knew how to translate that look. Come with me, you fool. With a swirl of her skirt, she led him out of the cottage and across the stone path to the outbuilding. Her workshop, bright and airy and open to clear out the smell of varnish. Its walls were the color of sea foam. Its windows faced a panoramic view of the Pacific. And it was always full of driftwood. Most of the pieces were still raw, just as they had been harvested from the beach. The rest were in various stages of processing and transformation. Every chunk she brought in was its own starter kit. Anything from simple projects like necklace racks to elaborate constructions like lampstands and chandeliers that she sold to galleries from Portland to Santa Barbara. Last year, she'd taken hundreds of seemingly useless fragments and, or anyone else might have seen only kindling, turned them into a mosaic of a whimsical octopus with spiral seashells for eyes. Gale snatched up a sun-bleached branch the length of his arm, peppered with perforations as if someone had used it for target practice. After almost 20 years of seeing me do this, you never wondered where these holes come from. I guess I thought it was weathering. By her skeptical look, she wasn't buying it. Okay, I guess I never thought about it at all. She gave him one of those shakes of her head, playful but dismissive, that left him feeling she had so much more wisdom than he did, baked in from birth. If it doesn't eat the surfboard out from under you, it doesn't exist, right? Pretty much, he conceded. As a rule, ignorance was no virtue, but if you gave too much thought to the sea, and everything with teeth and called it home, you'd never venture out to meet it. Maybe that was why she stayed on shore. They grilled on the patio that evening, marinated tempeh and vegetables, and as they usually did unless the rain had other ideas, carried their plates out to the wrought iron table on the little redwood deck so they could eat beneath the sky, facing the sea. The cottage was one of a haphazard nest of 6, perched near the edge of a 200-foot cliff overlooking the beach and breakers below. Bellies full, they kicked their feet up on the brick retaining wall around the fire pit and passed the evening's joint back and forth. Danny wanted to say he liked it better living at the condo in Santa Monica, and Gale liked it better here, but that wasn't true. Santa Monica was only more convenient. He liked it better here too. Time passed differently here, the days longer, the seasons more pronounced. On the luckiest nights, he might awaken to the faraway squeal of a passing whale. Humpback, he supposed. The only kind he was aware of whose songs carried above water. He would roll over to find that Gale was already up, her silhouette framed by the bedroom window, where she sat as still as stone, and listened for as long as it would last. They never got that in Santa Monica. Although she was never farther away from him than she was in those minutes, lost inside a trance, and there was little he could do to get her back but wait. Anyway, that with it, he'd been meaning to bring it up for months. Now, felt as right as ever. I'm gonna have to find a business to go into, or invent. Telling the water, but for Gale's ears. Any suggestions? She looked more concerned with diagnosing causes. Is it the fear? Well, that wasn't it, but it made sense she would go there. They'd have to give the topic a couple of airings after his wipeout this spring at Preveley Park. The bigger the wave, the more ways a ride could go wrong. Miscalculations, human error, the never-predictable hydraulics of any given wave. However it happened, things went wrong. While you went shooting through the tube, the board got sucked up the wall of water curling over behind you, while the wave rose up while the bottom dropped out, and you got slammed into the impact zone. You were no longer riding the wave. It was riding you, maybe grinding you into the sand and rocks that really teach you a lesson. He knew no greater helplessness than that. Being held under by the first wave was terror enough. If you were still down when the next one came crashing in, you felt exponentially worse, battered and exhausted and desperate to breathe. Still hadn't surfaced before a third one came along? That was when it seemed as though the ocean had made up its unfathomable mind. It wasn't letting go. He'd known a couple guys who hadn't come up alive, but he had. No idea how, but after a 3-wave hold down at Preveley Park, he had. The ocean doesn't want me today. It was as good an explanation as any. But one day it might. It was the reason he'd taken up freediving, to extend his breath-holding duration, to get comfortable with being under the water a long time, because as a surfer, under was the last place anyone wanted to be. And it had helped. He felt recalibrated, more at peace with under than ever. So no, this had nothing to do with fear. It's worse, he said. It's the calendar and the numbers. Gale had been holding back a toke and lost it with a hacking laugh. I thought it would be at least another 20 years before maybe I'd hear you make a concession there. She fixed him with a hazy leer. Who are you, foul thing that crawled from the sea? And give me back my Danny. Which version? He was developing a nostalgic longing for the Danny Yukimura who seemed incapable of thinking about consequences. Gale rubbed his arm. It's just another birthday with a 0. Don't you know? 40 is the new 18. I think is what it's down to. Well, that only helps if 18 is the new as yet unborn. He took the joint, made it smolder, handed it back. It's the rankings. In the top 30 in the world, I've had a good run. But I've never gotten higher than 22, and now I'm right back on the edge. The only place to go is down. That's how this goes. Especially now. It was the times. Thrilling to be around to witness them, but shitty when you were a casualty because you couldn't keep up. People were out there doing amazing things, unthinkable things, feats that had been considered impossible. There's something changing in the world. He traced it back to when Laird Hamilton had caught that millennium wave in Tir Hupwo. Until then, nobody had ridden a 60-foot wave. Nobody. It wasn't merely the height, it was the length, the girth, the colossal magnitude. Even Hamilton hadn't been planning on it. He got towed into the wave, then it rose a behemoth. As the tube collapsed behind him, everybody watching thought he was dead, until he came shooting up out of the spray. A thing like that did something magical. It opened a doorway to unknown realms of potential. 80-footers, 90-footers. Guys were riding them now. It wasn't only surfers either. Skateboarders, skiers, snowboarders, superhumans were popping up everywhere. Somebody does something that blows minds around the globe and everyone says, "Damn, dude, that record's gonna stand for years." Then it doesn't even stand a season. Something in the air, maybe. Something in the water. He loved seeing it unfold in the world. It was a beautiful time to be alive, but it wasn't his arena anymore. He couldn't compete with that. Go big or go home. He was home. He just had no idea what to do next. "So you launch your own line of boards or gear or both," Yale said. "Or you open up the Danny Ukumura School of Surfing and turn into one of those cute old guys with the long white hair and wispy beard, but still badass, and wait for people to come to you. Because they will." He wanted to believe. Yale made it easy to believe, even if he still ached for more and had no idea what it was. Before the dawn, even before coffee, they made their way along the stairs that zigzagged down a cleft in the land from cliff top to sea level. The wooden steps were perpetually damp, even in summer, crowded over by trees so that the sun never reached them. They nearly always had the shore to themselves when beach walking this early, sharing it with at most a neighbor from above, out with a dog and a stick. He knew of no place where dawn was more different from dusk than here, with the sun on the other side of the continent, behind a 200-foot wall of rock and earth. Here, dawns were gradual and gray, a time of mist and fog. This morning, the wind was up, sending ribbons of fine, dry sand skimming over the damp, packed plains of the beach. The surf rolled and pounded behind a veil, as if the sand were of one world and the water of another, and every sunrise it took the proper spell to bring them back together. They wouldn't be going home empty-handed. They never did. The only variable was what Gale would find, and how long it would take after she shook his hand and went on the hunt. He'd never met anyone more suited to spend her life seaside, not merely to live here, but thrive. She smelled of the sea, tasted of it. Even the ocean knew its own. The sea had recognized this about her as soon as Gale arrived for good, a couple years before they'd met. She had grown up Midwestern, landlocked in every direction, but the farthest shores had always called her from as early a time as she could remember. A week after her 18th birthday, she made the 1,500-mile trek west, one way this time. A week after that, one morning's beach walk set her up for years, when she came upon what appeared to be a peculiar yellowish rock, stone-like, yet waxy, embedded in the sand. Right away, she'd known it for what it really was: ambergris, a solidified lump of secretions from the belly of a sperm whale, nearly 3 pounds of it. No substance on earth was more prized by the makers of perfume, especially in France. It was illegal to sell in the States, though, so one impromptu trip to Canada later, she returned 3 pounds lighter, $140,000 heavier, and after making the down payment on the cottage, had hardly left the ocean side ever since. Such a find had to be more than dumb luck. Yale had taken it not merely as a welcome, but as a blessing. You're where you belong now. This is your home. It's always been your home. You just had to find your way back. The sea never stopped giving to her. Danny had never seen anything like it, the sheer reliability of it. Some days the swells didn't want to be surfed, and you had to accept that. But Gale and her walks along the shore, harvesting the ocean's cast-offs, she always came back with something, and the desires to see what she could make of it sent her out beachcombing with 10 other people, and there was a good chance she'd come back with more treasure than everyone else combined. He imagined salt-encrusted nymphs out in the surf, working on her behalf. Look alive, mateys. It's her again. Heave to. This morning, the farther north they walked, the lighter the dawn became. as ahead of them, Neptune's throne took shape out of the gray haze. Neptune's throne was all he'd ever heard anyone call it. It was an observation platform for surfers to watch the incoming, but whoever had built it hadn't made it particularly convenient. It was 4 solid tree trunk pillars driven deep into the sand, braced with crossbeams and supporting a planked deck just above head height. No steps. If you wanted to clamber onto it, you had to have either the upper body strength to pull yourself up, or friends to push you from below. It had a back like a gargantuan chair, a windbreak, he assumed, blocking what the cliffs didn't. 2 of the trunks joined above the platform with an X, which in turn supported a row of ragged planks that were shortest on the outside and rose to an imperial peak in the middle. The deck was usually thatched, and at first glance the bristly edges gave it the look of something that belonged somewhere tropical. Kimo recalled more of Hawaii than he did, and said the thing reminded him of rough-hewn structures he'd seen in places tourists didn't get to, burial platforms, and shrines where fishermen laid offerings to the gods of the sea before heading out, or after rowing back in with their catch. Keep looking at it though, and the tropical impression faded, darkened. Danny wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the 2 front trunks topped out with the flare stumps of long-gone limbs as thick as the trunks themselves. Neither appeared shaped by hand, only weathered, yet each had the look of a skull that faced the sea, like the bones of a pair of malformed whales. Who had first built the thing and when? Questions no one could answer. If their neighbor Felicia was to be believed, Neptune's throne was older than he was, and her as well. Felicia had lived atop the cliff for 50 years, and claimed the structure was there when she and her husband moved in. Claimed as well she'd seen a photo dated decades earlier from the time of the Great Depression, and it was standing then too, meaning none of today's throne could have been the original wood. It was too well maintained to have withstood over 80 years of weathering. But in the years he and Gail had been dividing their time between here and Santa Monica, he'd never seen anyone repair it, only use it. When they passed by, Gail patted one of the gray weathered anchor posts as if it were the leg of a friendly elephant. He lingered, fingertips tracing the little holes along the wood. He knew what they were now, but wasn't pleased about that. As if there were a chance he could probe far enough inside to find a tangle of worms that had learned how to live outside the sea. In their present direction, north, they were nearing their terminus, where a point of land fit for a lighthouse curved around from the right and speared out into the waves. At the base of the wall ran a stream fed by tributaries that trickled down the hillsides, then joined and cut ever-changing channels in the sand before emptying into the sea. It was here she found it, a still wet chunk of driftwood the size of a truncated log, mired in the sand of a delta that might not be here tomorrow morning, erased by the tide and recut somewhere else. Gail knelt. She scraped off sand and picked away rags of seaweed. "You want to do the honors, my strong guy?" Danny wrestled it free of the beach's hold and stood it on end. It was lighter than it looked, would be lighter still after it dried. Regardless, he didn't relish the thought of lugging it 200 feet up slick wooden stairs. "Wow," she said after she had a longer look. "If I didn't know better, and maybe I don't, I'd say this was something that had already been carved." They traded places, Gail holding it up while he stepped back for a view. She was right. It had a suggestion of form. Human, or maybe he was biased that way. Still, working with the contours and curves of what remained, he could discern legs pressed together and thickening into hips, a waist and sloping shoulders, a head. It would be unrecognizable without a head. The figurehead of a ship's prow, maybe? He recalled yesterday's yacht, being gnawed to slivers on the ocean floor. Maybe not that boat in particular, a stray chunk of someone else's bad luck. The ocean was forever digesting the remains of bad luck and coughing up the pieces. A lot of figureheads were big-breasted women, traditionally speaking. Beside it, Gale went ramrod straight and perked up her chest, comparing. If I squint just right, I can make out a couple boobs. She looked him in the eye, squinty. And if you say, but what about the wood, I will murder you in your sleep. She had him call heads or tails. Then they took their places at either end and began to shuffle the thing home. 2 days later, she found another one washed up half a mile to the south. Longer by a few inches, but shaped almost identically. 2 half-rotted figureheads on the same beach at the same time? Not likely. By now, he was leaning toward dismissing it as a case of pareidolia, the tendency to see ships in clouds, the man in the moon, and Jesus on a burnt tortilla, or making a face out of 2 holes, a bump, and a line. Even so, lugging them home felt like carrying corpses, complete with grave worms. The sodden outer wood sloughed and squished in its uncertain grip. Halfway up the cliff with the second one, his fingers broke through as if piercing a crust, and pulped an embedded shipworm as thick as a sausage. He nearly dropped the log and went down with it. The stairs were damp underfoot and slick with wet flora, treacherous for carrying this kind of load. When Gale found the third one a few days later, he had no idea what to make of it. If pareidolia was simple pattern recognition, okay then, what sort of pattern was this? On the surface, it seemed the same old relationship Gale had always had with the sea and the generosity of its tides, but it had never given her the same exact thing time after time. If it was going to do that, why not be really generous and keep lobbing more lumps of ambergris at her? She first left her finds outside on heavy racks to dry in the July sun, turning them every few hours like hot dogs in a grill. Then, she moved them into her workshop, lined them against one wall, standing in a row. They turned pale now that they were dry, bleached by the elements and time. With the muck wiped off and the water bloat gone, finer details emerged. The pieces all tapered and thickened the same way, with dual concavities that suggested eyes, and a nub that suggested a nose, and a crack against the grain for a mouth. They were just humanoid enough that Danny didn't like turning his back on them, as if they were shells that would break open and release some worse form gestating inside. Gotta be a simple explanation, Chemo told him on the boat while out on another free-diving trip. Maybe there's something that fell off a cargo ship. Some shipment of carvings that weren't very good to begin with. Or there's some asshole out here who lives on a boat, thinks he's an artist, more money than talent, and dumps his mistakes overboard when nothing turns out the way he wants. Whatever they are, not that they're washing up, they look that much worse. Incompetent artists, Danny said. Really? That's your explanation? If you had a better one, you wouldn't have asked me what I thought. Point taken. But the wobble in this theory was that nothing about any of these pieces appeared to have been carved. Danny had looked, then closely. No evidence of chisels, rasps, scrapers, draw knives. They showed no signs of hand tooling at all. Even the ends looked broken, not sawed. What was the likelihood that someone who couldn't turn out a carving that looked more than vaguely human was, nevertheless, skilled enough to keep everything smooth, free of facets? Erosion, where? Chemo said. You ever see a jagged stone in a riverbed? Not me. Pick any rock. You don't know how it looked when it went in. You're just getting what's left. And when Gale found another, number 4, but it was counting, Danny wasn't even surprised. Well, yes, he was, not by the find, but by the irritation he felt at the news. How many of these things did she need anyway? Just because they washed up, did that obligate her to accept every single one? Bring them all home? It wasn't like him to be resentful. But analyze it anyway. Things hadn't merely come easily for Gale. They came effortlessly. The ocean gave, and never ran out. All she had to do was show up and take possession. He'd be lucky to be able to make a decent living doing something he loved, but it had never come easily. It had taken thousands of hours of wave time to hone his skills. It had taken near drownings, lacerations from coral, jellyfish stings, reef rash, a staph infection, various sprains, 2 separate concussions when the board smacked him in the head. And that was before factoring in every competitor on the tours breathing down his neck, eager to take his ranking and sponsorships for themselves. Worst of all, it was life with an expiration date. He couldn't keep doing it forever, and he was nearly there. He could feel the downward pull as surely as he felt it during a dive, after entering the doorway to the deep. Gale, though, went on as ever, bringing up trinkets as though she were being wooed by the same sea that she claimed to love, but wouldn't go out on, not even with him. As she began to spend more hours in her workshop than ever, he wondered if it was karmic payback. If this was what it had been like for her over 2 decades, forced to share him with a passion that consumed him, sent him around the world to wherever the waves were at their biggest and baddest. From Mavericks to Waimea Bay, from Tavarua to Padong. Maybe that was the part that hadn't come easily for her. But by the time the 5th figure turned up, even Gale seemed past taking any joy in it. Something about this was not right. It had never been quite right. This feels like a cat sometimes, bringing you its kills, she confessed in the workshop one evening. At the bank of windows, the sun dropped boiling red into the cauldron of the sea. It loves you, but it's love on a whole different wavelength. He had no idea what to say to that. Along the north wall, the carvings seemed to be daring him to try. He was beginning to hate them. Whatever secret they knew, they weren't telling. At the center of the shop, a rectangular work table, as stout and sturdy as a stage, held 6 pieces of driftwood in various stages of transformation. Sculptures and a bonsai planter, none of which had progressed in 3 days. All Gale did now was come out and sit with them, seemingly stymied by the new arrivals that were piling up, as if they'd come to tell her that her work was at an end. Her methods hadn't changed in all the time he'd loved her, across 19 years of being together, 17 of marriage. Each piece of driftwood she harvested merited its own staring contest, a still, silent interrogation during which she divined what it wanted to be, needed to be, in its new and resurrected life. But these unblinking humanoids, Gale was treating them as if they were complete already, and no need of refinement. They didn't seem to be going anywhere. Like her, they were home. You know, we've done the seaside thing for more than half of our lives, he said. If I'll be retiring soon anyway, maybe we should give mountains a try. She almost laughed. Lie awake at night listening for elk? I don't know if that would work or not. She turned at the window and faced the rolling waters. He followed her gaze in case there was something to see, but if there was, only Gale could see it. Did you ever hear about the 52 Hertz whale? She said. He had not. It's the saddest thing ever. Researchers have been picking it up on hydrophones for years. It's only ever been heard, never seen. She was facing the window as if telling the ocean, and he was just around to eavesdrop. This whale, this one single whale that sings at a higher frequency than all the others, 52 hertz. All the usual suspects, blue whales, fin whales like that, they're down around 15 or 20 or 30, so nobody ever knows what kind of whale this is. All they know is that it just keeps roaming the Pacific, calling out, singing its song, and nothing else is answering. She turned her back to the window, facing him again. Better keep your mountains. I don't think I could handle that with an elk. They'll come right up in your front yard. He left her to it, all of it, the worm-eaten pieces of wood and the stalled magic she wielded over them, and traded the workshop for twilight. Out here on the grass, the 5th refugee carving remained wedged in its drying rack. Horizontal, it looked helpless. As he stepped closer, Danny wondered how she would react if he dragged it toward the setting sun and threw it off the cliff. He hadn't given this one a second look since it was cleaned off and mostly dry. What would have been the point? They were all the same, more or less. Except this one wasn't. He dared to touch it, to run his hand over what had been obscured before and was still barely visible. A faint impression scored around it, near the bottom end, like the groove of a finger after taking off a wedding ring, tattooed with a trace of rust. No way, he thought. This whole time, assuming these had started out as ordinary logs, when they were nothing of the sort. No way. The great thing about Chemo was that there was almost nothing he wouldn't drop at a moment's notice to take his boat out. He'd saved the GPS coordinates of the sunken yacht, so even after 3 weeks it was easy to find again. Once Danny was in the water, Chemo waved the coil of rope before tossing it over the side. "I'm giving you a longer leash, so leave it on. If you touch the lanyard this time, I'm going to break your arm." "Yes, Mom." Danny huffed wind to saturate himself, filled up, locked it in, then ducked and plunged. By now he'd been trading his frogman flippers for a monofin. Chemo called it his mermaid ass. It fit over both feet and forced his legs to move together, scything the water like a whale's flukes to turbocharge each kick. It made the hardest part of the dive easier, if no faster. He could equalize the pressure in his head only so quickly, but it took less energy to power downward, dolphin kicking, and to maneuver around once he got below neutral buoyancy, and that was what mattered. 76 feet down, the wreck waited in the hushed indigo haze, still tipped onto its starboard side with its mast jutting down into the ooze. And if the boat still unnerved him, helpless, disintegrating in a grave of silt and mud, it was at least familiar now. He knew it was pointless to check the prow for a figurehead, but felt compelled to do it anyway. And, of course, there was no evidence of one ever having been there. He turned onto his side and swam parallel to the sea floor, really mermaiding it now, cruising the length of the deck from bow to stern, inspecting the damage and the rot. He was gliding back the opposite way when it struck him. He'd been so focused on the small details that he had missed the big, obvious one right in front of him. He'd been looking for a hole ripped in the deck, or a broken stump, evidence of a missing mast. He'd been looking over what remained for signs of mast hoops, iron reinforcements especially, that might have chafed a groove of rust and wear around the bottom of its mast in the push and pull of the currents. And they were there. It was only when he took in the big picture that he realized, 3 weeks ago, the wreck had 2 masts, angled down toward the sediment. Now there was only one, the foremast. There appeared to have been 3 in total, masts detached from wrecked ships. Sure, it happened. But where were they now? No telling how long the rearward mizzen had been gone, but within the past 22 days, the main mast shouldn't have gotten far. Shouldn't, but had. He feared he could guess where the 30-plus feet of them might have ended up. Where, but not how. There was no how he could imagine. There was no how he wanted to imagine. There was only his quickening heart and the hunger to breathe in the air above the waves. He surfaced and plunged again, like a pearl diver looking for a prize too big to be misplaced. He widened his search to the limits of his safety line, and still, it wasn't enough. Looking out toward deeper waters, beyond the spot where he caught that glimpse of the whale emerging through the dim blue, he saw how the seafloor sloped away, and that down the incline some indistinct patch of shadow waited. A trick of the light would waver. This didn't waver. "We need to move," he told Chemo the next time he surfaced. 40 or 50 yards that way. Never thought he'd see Chemo balk at piloting the boat. "Dude, you've had a month of downtime since the Corona Open. Is this really how you want to spend your final days of it? Instead of getting your mind on the Billabong Pro?" Treading water, spitting salt. "Yeah, it is. It helps. Everything helps. What's so special about 50 yards that way? Because I'm ready for it." Chemo made the move, grumbling, but insisted on doing a sonar reading of the bottom. 94 feet. Danny had never dived that far. Not a huge leap from last week's new personal best of 83, but still, it meant more pressure and another 22 feet of round trip. This was not insignificant. He went anyway. Deeper, bluer, colder, darker. He relaxed into the squeeze, welcoming it like an embrace. From above and to the side, he couldn't yet tell what was waiting below. Submerged another 18 feet lower than the yacht, even less light reached his target zone. But it was more than that. The water looked cloudier here, too. As his vision acclimated to the gloom, he could make out what appeared to be a slab on the sea floor, 3 times the width of a car, furred with growth and set in the midst of a forest of bull kelp. Their stalks swayed in the currents with their fronds wavering like pennants in a breeze. The further he sank, and the closer he drifted, the less natural the slab looked. Like a mound of sand and mud and stones, scraped into a heap and packed together with intent. For no reason he wanted to explore, its flatness and order, its look of purpose, reminded him of the work table in Gale's shop. Again he was overcome with the uneasy sense of facing something out of place, lost from above, and drowned without pity. Because rising from the mound was a grove of logs, 8 of them, seemingly jammed into the muck to hold them in place. Their tops were ragged, splintered, a sight that nearly locked his mind. He could imagine no force in the sea that could take a ship's mast and break it up this orderly way, or would even want to. Around each piece, a thrashing cloud of motion churned and blurred the water. By now he knew a shipworm on sight. Even at their most normal, they still filled him with loathing. But he didn't think they were supposed to behave like this. Hundreds of them visible, like hagfish, burrowed into the side of a decomposing whale. They streamed over the wood with the furious energy of a feeding frenzy. The dread crept in cold from the outer dark. This was something no one was meant to see. Ever. A hiker would feel this way stumbling across the half-eaten carcass of a mule deer, then smelling the musk and carrion scent of the returning grizzly. Danny flicked his fin to drift close enough to see the hard little shells on the worms' heads, scoring the wood, shaping it as surely as rasps and chisels and lathes. He recognized the human form gnawed free from the lengths of mast. Anyone would. He knew their contours. He logged their predecessors up from the beach 5 times already. And among the 3 that appeared farthest along, he recognized the face, taking shape out of the grain. He had loved it for the past 19 years. Danny tried to will the sight away as an illusion born of low light and a brain hungry for oxygen, but it wouldn't resolve into anything else. He pinched off a half-dozen of the worms, fat and lashing, and flung them to the silt so he could caress his hand along the fresh-carved visage. Even blind, in the dark of an infinite abyss, he would know that cheekbone, that nose, that jawline, that hollow at the throat. Already the worms he'd dropped were wriggling back up to her face to dig back in and resume their tasks. Mindless, they seemed to obey a directive he couldn't begin to fathom. But if something out here was capable of snapping a ship's mast into pieces like a pencil, then maybe it followed that it had workers. Drones subjugated by the kind of group mind that turned a school of fish in perfect unison. There was no why he wanted to imagine either. 5 above, 8 down here, and who knew how many more might be drifting unfinished somewhere between. In revulsion, in the grip of something he felt but could not name, he gave the foremost effigy a shove to send it toppling back, pulling free of the muck and thunking into another behind it. Then a third gave way. A slow chain reaction that disturbed the silt, but the worms not at all. Abruptly, his legs were yanked from beneath him and he was upside down again, moving up and away, something reeling him like a fish. He nearly panicked and lost the breath locked inside until the tug on his ankle made sense. Chemo being chemo again. He couldn't right himself under the tension, never enough slack to turn around. Rather than flail at the end of the rope, he relaxed and let it happen until he broke the surface, spewing bubbles and foam, and breathed with a violent gasp, once more a creature of land and air. Chemo peered down from the boat as if expecting to see him floating motionless. Huh. Must have set another personal best without even realizing. How long? Danny said. Normal. He had to act normal. 7 minutes. 7. Whoa. He would have never guessed. I had to pull the plug, and yet... You're fine. You sound disappointed about that. No, that's good. Chemo shook his head. Never again. Never again. You need to find somebody else to take you off for this, brother. All you do is scare the shit out of me. Poor Chemo. Danny felt genuinely bad for him. Bad for them both. Because it wouldn't have helped one bit to tell Chemo that no, he wasn't fine. He hadn't come up fine at all. Worse, he couldn't tell Gale either. How was he supposed to convey a thing like this? They're you. They're supposed to be you. He couldn't even be sure how she would react. If she'd find it flattering, the best thing since ambergris, or if the balance would tip and this weird synergy between her and the sea would finally leave her spooked. Once she picked up on the obvious, that something was bothering him, his only option was to lie. Had a bad dive, burst a blood vessel in my nose. It happens. All he could do was look ahead, try to get her away for 2 weeks, inject some time and distance to break this encroaching spell, and leave whatever carvings might wash up next for someone else to find. Why don't you come with me to Tahiti, for the Billabong? It's been years. Well, I know, but I should stay. I don't have the kind of work I can take with me. She was hardly doing the work now. It'll still be here when you get back. You might even get some new ideas there to bring home. Like tiki carvings? I went through my tiki phase years ago. Oh, right. She had. He packed and planned and tried his best to make it sound enticing. Seeing the Pacific from another side would do them good. This could be the last time he went there as a competitor. None of it seemed to quite get through. I know. I just like it here. There's something about here. Some people go their whole lives looking for the place they should be. I found mine here. A long time ago. Even before she'd found him. Gail was too kind to say so, but it had to have crossed her mind. He was one more gift the sea had given her. The one thing it was most capable of taking back. That worried her. It had all along. I love you. You've always been my anchor, she would tell him. But it scares me what could happen if the anchor chain ever broke. In that way of sounds, unusual enough to penetrate, familiar enough to not alarm, it wove its way into his dreams before teasing him awake. The dream dissolved at once, so he lay in the dark with the only thing left, the far, reverberant squeal of a whale, rolling in across the water and floating up through the open window. Listen, he whispered, and reached over to give Gail a gentle shake, but her side of the bed was empty, a sure sign she was listening already. She wasn't at the window, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in the bathroom or front room. He knew the feel of a house emptied of any other heartbeat than his own. Danny yanked on enough clothing to call himself decent, a t-shirt and shorts that felt backwards, then stumbled outside. But she wasn't on the deck either. The night was as bright as nights got. all moon and no clouds, and the sea a glittering expanse of silver white and blue black. It was the world. It was their entire world. Braced against the redwood deck, he peered down at the beach. After a moment, his fingers gripped the rail with the same steadying ferocity as his toes gripped a surfboard. He felt every bit as much in motion, shooting through a rolling barrel that collapsed behind him. From up here, he was so accustomed to the sight of Neptune's throne that the high-backed platform was as familiar a fixture of the landscape as the ridge on which they lived. But now its shape was different. Wrong. He couldn't see what, exactly, only that some hulking form occupied it, bulbous and enormous, wet enough and slick enough to catch the moonlight with an iridescent gleam. To his left, a form no bigger than a person traversed toward it, small and dark against the pale sands. He heard it again, rebounding from the cliffs, the same high, rolling squall that had brought him awake, the forlorn cry he'd always taken for a passing whale, roaming the endless waters and calling out for what or who might answer. Danny sprinted for the beach stairs, the zigzag flights up which he'd helped lug a lifetime's worth of the sea's gifts, clueless, never imagining what it might have wanted or expected in return. Pounding down the steps, he was as good as blind, the moonlight trapped above the canopy of leaves that crowded up and over. Although he held the rail, heedless of the splinters he'd picked up along the way, he went tumbling before he knew what happened. Something damp and slick sliding beneath his bare foot. His leg torqued one way while the rest of him torqued another. If pain glowed, his knee would have lit the light. No wave had ever flung him more violently than this, than gravity and his own momentum. He juddered down the stairs, sometimes on his hip, sometimes on his rump, every hardwood step another bruise. When he thudded to a stop, he had 2 flights left to go, and scooted the rest of the way on his ass. Down on the beach, he tried to stand, but his knee wasn't having it. He tumbled to the sand, still warm from the day's sun. He crawled, striving to see through the pink haze of pain, first making out the moon-etched lines of the cliffs ahead, and then below them, the suggestion of some lesser mountain that rose up and slouched back toward the sea. Then he crawled until he found a line of dimples in the sand, footprints, unbroken and resolute. He followed them, dragging his useless leg behind him, hearing nothing but the wheeze of his breath and the crash and retreat of the waves. He crawled into the pillars and planks of Neptune's throne loomed above him, empty now, but darkened with water and draped with robes of seaweed, the air around it rich with a heavy musk of brine. The sand before it was churned to wet clumps and crooked furrows, as if between here and the water's edge the beach had been plowed by some dragging thing, bristling with appendages that had tried to walk, but was never meant to move on land. Alongside the disturbance, the line of her steps turned, veering toward the water. He followed these 2, scrambling on both elbows and one good knee, until they were no longer dimples but true footprints, pressed into the wet sand, heel and arch and 5 small toes. He scurried ahead, frantic now, as step by step the prints began to change, the impression left by each toe deepening, as though dug by a hooked and spiny claw, with a growth of webbing in between. He followed them to the foaming lip of the sea, where he lost them, her last footprints, erased, as the water washed across and smoothed the sand blank again. Still, he floundered onward as the waves battered him head-on, stopping only when he was slapped across the face and shoulder by something solid, heavy as a wet blanket, that clung like a cowl. Sputtering, he peeled it away, and when after the longest moments of his life, he accepted what the tattered thing was. He had no idea what to do with it. He couldn't bring himself to pitch it away, couldn't think of any reason to keep holding on. If Gale didn't need her skin anymore, then where on land or sea was it supposed to go? Out past the breakers, beneath the moon, a gleaming, bulbous dome submerged with an elephantine skrunk that he felt ripple through the waves and shudder through the sand. Then, he was alone. He knew the feel of a shore emptied of any other heartbeat than his own. He retreated far enough to keep from choking, then rolled onto his back to face the stars, exhausted and sweating from the pain. The water surged in and out for 1,000 cycles, and 1,000 more. In time, he wondered which of the ligaments in his knee were in shreds. ACL, PCL, LCL, MCL. Any and all. He surely had a motherfucker of a hamstring tear as well. Whatever the damage, his career was done, even sooner than expected. By the time Danny was ready to move again, the sky had lightened to a formless gray. Fog had crept in across the waters, and with it, a stinging drizzle of rain. His knee was swollen double, and he couldn't bend his leg, but nothing much hurt by default anymore. There was dawn enough for him to spy a familiar shape stranded in the channels, where the sea met the freshwater stream from the cliffs. He made for it, mocking thing that it was. As complete a carving as he'd seen, even farther along than the one sunk amid the kelp beds. Or maybe this was one of them, finished along the way. He knew its shape, knew the face, the hands folded as if in prayer, but he knew nothing of the depicted changes wrought upon the rest of her, the thin, frilled slits at either side of her throat, the fins along each forearm and lower leg. But he did know, and had all along, that she'd smelled of the sea, and tasted of it too, and that the ocean and its gods recognized their own. Gale must have known as well, somewhere inside. Must have cherished the sea even while living in fear that if she ever went out on it, she might not come back. It would never stop wanting her. He had to admit that this carving, all of them, appeared to have been made with love. But love, as Gale had said, on a whole different wavelength. He rolled the effigy back out into the surf, fighting the wishes of the waves, the most grueling task he'd ever done. But it was still a log at heart. It floated. The first 20 yards from shore were the hardest, the next 100 a little easier. He clung to this new gale until he could no longer push off the sandy bottom, then threw his good leg over and across, straddling it like a surfboard, and paddling out to sea. In time, the roar of the breakers faded behind him, until he was left with the quieter slop and splash of a calmer sea, as the dim sun rose over his shoulders and began to burn the fog away. He paddled as far as he could, until he thought he might have just 5 more good strong minutes left inside. The ocean yawned deep and dark beneath. He could still breathe, but with one leg, could he kick hard enough to overcome the air in his lungs? Could he reach that threshold that changed everything? He had to believe he could. 40 feet. He only had to make it another 40 feet. 2 days ago, he'd spent 7 minutes under, and it went like nothing. There had to be meaning in that. Superhumans were popping up everywhere, remember? Something in the air. Something in the water. A beautiful time to be alive. He rolled off the log and made the plunge. He would find Gale again. Or he wouldn't. He too was ready for another way of life. Or he wasn't. The ocean would accept him. Or it wouldn't. But he could still be a part of it. Either way.
Chilling tales for dark nights.